Hey folks, this video is the first 3 hours of my course, Build a Responsive Website, where I show you how to build a responsive website using HTML, pure CSS, and JavaScript. In this preview video, I'll show you how to set up VS Code and GitHub, navigate a Figma design, and set up the project files. Then we'll be building out the top navigation part of the website. Now, I do recommend knowing at least the basics of HTML and CSS before going through this video, but I do explain every step of the process along the way so that you can follow along and understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. And if you like this preview and want to check out the full course, everything is linked down below. All right, let's get into the video. All right, now that we've gone over what the course will cover, let's get started with our code editor, VS Code. To get VS Code, you want to go to code.visualstudio.com, download the version for your operating system, and then install the program on your computer. Now, once VS Code is installed, you can go ahead and run it. So the VS Code user interface is made up of the top menu bar, the left activity bar, which opens the left sidebar, the bottom status bar, the bottom panel, and then we have the editor taking up the rest of the space. Now in VS Code, you can open individual files or you can open folders. And when I'm coding, I'm usually going to open the project folder that I'm working in. So let's start by creating the project folder that we're going to be using in this course. So I'm opening Windows File Explorer and I'm currently on my desktop. So here we're going to create a new folder on the desktop and let's call it Responsive Website. Now that we have our folder created in Windows, let's go back to VS Code and we want to open that folder. So you can open the folder by going to the Explorer tool and opening the folder from here. You can also go to the File or the Code menu on Macs and select Open Folder. Then we want to choose the folder that we just created. And if you see this pop up asking if you trust the authors, just say yes, I trust the authors since you created this. Now, currently, the responsive website folder is empty, so let's create some files. Now, if you hover over the sidebar area, you are going to see some icons, and these icons are going from left to right: create new file, create new folder, refresh the Explorer, and then collapse folders. So let's create a new file, and let's call it index.html. Now in our index.html file, we can generate boilerplate HTML code using a shortcut from a tool called Emmet that's automatically part of VS Code. So to do this, type in exclamation point, and you can see in the pop-up menu, it says Emmet abbreviation with a preview of the code that's going to generate for us. So then we can hit enter or tab to add the code to our file. And let's save our changes. We also want to create some other files. So we're going to create another new file, and let's call this style.css for our CSS styles. And let's do it one more time, create another new file, and call this script.js. And now you can see that the files that we created are all showing up in the left sidebar in the Explorer panel. So next up, let's take a look at the activity bar, which is this one on the far left here. So under the Explorer tool, we have the search tool, which is useful for searching and running a find and replace in your code. Below that, we have the source control tool in case you want to use the integrated GitHub tool. Then under that is the debugging tool, and we're not going to be using it in this course, so you don't need to worry about it. However, under that is the extensions menu, which we will be using. So extensions are programs for VS Code that are written by other developers, and they're usually things like custom themes or plugins. Now, customizing your VS Code with themes is, in my opinion, one of the most fun parts of using VS Code. So let's look for some themes. In the extensions menu search bar, there's a filter icon here on the right side. So let's click that. Then we want to go to category and select themes. So now we can browse through different themes and see which ones that we like. So generally, there's two types of themes. You're going to have color themes, which control the colors of your VS Code. You also have file icon themes, which are the tiny icons next to the file name in the Explorer sidebar. Now, if you see a theme that you want to check out, what you can do is click there's going to be an install button on the right side, and you can click that to install it and then automatically run it in VS Code. Now, usually I use a theme that I created myself called Coder Dark. So if you want to install that too, just type in Coder Dark to your search bar here, and you can install this theme. Now, if you want to change the current theme from the current themes that you have installed, what you can do is go to File or Code if you're on a Mac, go down to Preferences, then go to Themes and select Color Theme. And then there's going to be a pop-up menu showing all the themes that you currently have installed. And you can use your arrow key to navigate through all of them to select the one that you want to use. And then for icon themes, what you can do is type in icon to filter for icons, and you can select the different icon themes you want to use. I'm currently using the material icon theme. Okay, next up, let's search for some other extensions that I like to use, and I am going to be using them in this course, so I do recommend that you install these yourself if you haven't already. So maybe the most important one that I use is Live Server. I'm currently using the one by Ritwick Day. There is another one that seems to be newer, but the original one seems to be working pretty fine for me. So what Live Server does is it's going to run a local website, and it's also going to reload the website automatically anytime you save changes to your files. Another extension that I like to use is Prettier. And what this does is it's going to automatically format all your code to give it proper indentation and spacing. Now in Prettier, once you have the extension installed, there are some settings that I like to use for it. So you can open up the settings by going to File or Code, Preferences, and then go to your settings. Then in your settings, you can search for Prettier to load all of your Prettier settings, and it's going to display all of them in alphabetical order. So one thing that people like to set is the number of spaces that a tab will give you. So in this setting called tab width, I have it set to 2 spaces. Obviously, you can set this to whatever you want. Now, another thing that you need to do is make sure that Prettier is going to be your default code formatter. So in your settings, search for default formatter. And here, just make sure that you have Prettier selected from the drop-down menu. And the last thing we want to do is make sure that Prettier runs anytime we save a file. So type in format, and you want to look for the editor format on save option. And then just make sure that this box is checked to format a file anytime you save it. Okay, so that should be it for Prettier. Now there is one more extension that I'm going to be using in this course, and that is called SVG, and the author is Jock. And this one allows you to preview SVG files right in VS Code, which is super handy. All right, so that's it for the VS Code setup and extensions configuration. Next up, we're going to start setting up our project files. All right, in this video, we're going to be setting up our project files as well as the GitHub repository that we'll need in order to deploy our final website. So we're going to be using the GitHub desktop app for this. I personally like it because I think it's a little easier for beginners to use the graphical user interface to visualize what's happening instead of using the default command line interface. Now, if you're not familiar with GitHub Desktop or GitHub in general, I do recommend that you go to my YouTube channel and watch a video that I have on Git and GitHub, which I have linked on this page. Then just make sure you have GitHub Desktop installed on your computer before continuing on. All right, so now let's set up our GitHub repository in the responsive website folder that we previously created. So in GitHub Desktop, you want to go up to the File menu and go to Add Local Repository. Then you want to select the folder that you just created. Then when you click Add Repository, it's going to tell you that this does not appear to be a Git repository. Do you want to create a repository here instead? And yes, we do want to do that. So click this Create a Repository link. Next, we want to check that all the settings here are the way that you want. So we have the GitHub repository name, which comes from the folder name. I'm also going to check the box to initialize a README file. And then under license, I'm going to select MIT license for open source. So when everything is set, you can click the Create Repository button. Okay, so now we've created our GitHub repository. So once this is done, let's go back to VS Code. All right, in our index.html file in VS Code, let's make some changes. First up, in the title tag, I'm going to change this to say Mythos. This is the name of the fictional agency whose website we're going to be making in the course. Next up, we want to load our CSS and JavaScript files. So under the title tag and the head tag, I'm going to type in the link, and let's select CSS, and this will load our CSS file. And in the href attribute, you just want to make sure that you start with a / to start the path from the project root. Then under that, let's load our JavaScript. So I'm going to type in script and select script source. And again, we want to start with a / in our source attribute and select script.js. We also want to add the defer property attribute to the script tag so that script loading is not going to block loading the rest of the website. And let's save our changes. So next up, let's add some quick placeholder content in our body tag so that we can, see our website when we are testing it. So in the body tag, I'm going to create an h1 tag, and in it, I'm going to type lorem 5, and this is an Emmet shortcut to create 5 words of lorem ipsum. We're also going to create a paragraph tag, so p, and then inside the paragraph tag, we can denote this with a right angle bracket to have the content inside the paragraph tag, and type in lorem, let's type in 100. And when we save, Prettier has wrapped the lines for us. Okay, so make sure everything is saved in our index.html file, and we are done with this for now. Next up, let's start writing our CSS styles. So I'm going to start by writing some boilerplate styles that I always use in my websites. First, on every element, which we can select for with the asterisk or wildcard, we're also going to select all before pseudo elements, and then all after pseudo elements as well. And in this selector, we want to type in box sizing border box. This is going to make sure that padding and border will not add on top of any width or height set on an element, but be included in the final size. And you definitely want to have the style rule every time, otherwise you're going to run into some weird issues when you're sizing elements. The next style rule is also going to be set on all elements, so with the asterisk selector, and we don't need to worry about the pseudo elements for this, we want to set margin to 0. And this is basically a CSS reset type rule, and it cancels out some resets or styles that come baked in every browser. This is because the browser by default is going to give some elements a margin, for example, the body tag, h tags, paragraph tags, and list tags. And this can add spacing that you weren't really expecting to the top and bottom of elements. So I prefer to just start by zeroing everything out, and then we can add margin in later, only in the places that we actually need a margin. Another default rule I like to do is to remove the default underline from links. So for all anchor tags, A, I'm going to write text decoration and set it to none. This is going to remove that underline. Next up is some styles that we're going to add on image tags, picture tags, and SVG tags. These are all for loading images, and one thing we want to prevent is if you have a really giant image file size for some reason, you don't want to have the huge image full size on screen because it could potentially cause horizontal scrolling. So to prevent this, what we want to do is set all of these to have a max width of 100%. This is going to mean that they won't get larger than their parent. We also want to set these to be display block. This will allow us to position them in layouts better and also to get rid of this little bit of space at the bottom of inline elements that the browser leaves for usually text letters. So for example, lowercase p, lowercase y, they have a descender, which means the part of the letter extending below the baseline. And this is for inline elements, and image tags are by default inline elements. And we really don't need that space because it's just an image, it's not text. So we want all of these to not have that, and we can do that with the display block rule. Okay, so these are all the boilerplate styles that I'm using here. Some of these I have learned from Josh Como's blog, which I do highly recommend you check out if you haven't yet. I have linked his CSS Reset article in the resources and tools section. So that's pretty good for our styles for now. Now let's go to our script.js file, and I'm going to add some test code just to make sure everything is working correctly. So let's write console log hello world and save. The next thing we want to do is we want to load our website locally using the live server extension. So once you have that extension installed, in the bottom right hand corner, you should see this button that says Go Live. When you click that, it's going to load a local server and a new browser window or tab should open. And in the URL bar, you should see 127.0.0.1 port 5500. And this is the local address where your local server is running. Now I'm using the Firefox browser, and I do like it because it's a little more privacy-minded than Chrome. It also has some really nice Flexbox and grid inspection tools that I like. So you can use Chrome or whatever browser you want, but just letting you know that I'm using Firefox in this course. So let's inspect our code using the developer tools. So to do this, you can press F12, you can press Ctrl-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I on Macs. You can also right-click anywhere in the website and select Inspect, and this will open our developer tools. So up in the inspector, in the source code section, I'm going to click on the body tag. And once we have this element selected in the bottom panel, in the rules tab, you can actually see the style rules that we just created. And we can see that they're taking effect, which is good. So we have the margin 0 style rule that we added, and we have the box sizing border box style rule. We also want to check our JavaScript. So if we go up to the console and just make sure that you have logs turned on, we can see that we have the hello world message. And I'm reloading here just to show this error message. So if you see this error, it's basically because we don't have a favicon set up yet. And don't worry about this, we are going to set this later on. Before we start building our website, let's take a look at GitHub Desktop and start committing our code. In our repository, you should see all of the code changes in the Changes tab. Now, when you're using Git to track your code changes, one thing that you need to figure out is how often you want to make a commit in order to save your progress. You don't want to wait until the very end when you've completely finished coding the entire website and make one giant commit there, but you also don't need to make a commit every single time you change a single line of code. So what I usually try to do is whenever I've finished what feels like a complete little step in development, or if I write some code that I'm not completely confident about, which I might need to revert in the future. So in this course, I'm going to be showing you when I make commits as I build this website, so you can see how often I commit, and then you can decide for yourself how often you want to commit your code. So let's make a commit to save all the changes that we've created so far. So in GitHub Desktop, you want to check over the changed files just one more time to make sure that nothing is getting committed that you don't actually want. And then once you've checked the files and everything seems good, you want to go down to the bottom left corner here, and you can type in a commit message. So I'm going to call this project setup. Then at the bottom, you can click the commit to main button, and this will create the commit. So once we've created it, if we go to the history tab, we can see the commit that we just made so far. And you might also see one commit that says initial commit. This is from GitHub Desktop generating all of the files when you created the repository, and it's going to automatically make this commit for you. Now I'm also going to publish the repository on GitHub since we haven't done that yet. So up until now, the repository has only existed on our local computer. Once we publish, it'll also exist up as a remote repository on GitHub. This is what will make it accessible by other developers, and also when we deploy it to a production server. Now, once the repository is published, when you're making future commits, the button is going to let you push your changes to origin, meaning the remote repository on GitHub. And you don't always have to push every time you make a commit. For me, what I'll usually do is I'll push my changes up to the remote repository either at the end of the day at work or if another developer needs to check out the code changes that I've made. All right, so we've set up our project files. Next, we're going to look at our Figma design file. All right, so we've set up our project files and our GitHub repository. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you how to get the design loaded in your Figma account and how to look at the design to get the style information that we need for our CSS styles. Now, just a disclaimer, I am by no means a Figma expert. I'm only going to be showing you some of the basics of how to look at Figma designs as a web developer. There are a lot more advanced features of Figma that I'm not going to be covering here, just because they're more for people using Figma to create website designs. Now, first off, if you haven't already, you should download the Figma file, which I have in a zip file called basicresponsivewebsite.zip from the course page below this video player. Then once you have the file, you will need to log into Figma at figma.com. And if you don't have an account there, you can sign up for free. Now, once you're logged into Figma, you should see a dashboard, something like this. And what we want to do now is we want to import that Figma file that you downloaded. On the dashboard, there should be a button that says Import File. And you can see it's up here on the top right-hand corner. So you can click that button, and then you want to select the Figma file. Make sure you're not selecting the zip file. You do need to unzip it and take out the .fig Figma design file. And then you can click the Import button to import it into your dashboard. So once that's done, you should see the Figma file appear on your dashboard. And then you can double click it to open the design. Now in the Figma design, in the left sidebar here, there are a list of several artboards or what Figma calls frames. There's one for desktop, which is sized at 1440 pixels, and then one for mobile at 375 pixels. Then we have a favicon image, and then we have some author images. Now, you might be wondering why there's no tablet design, only desktop and mobile. And the reason for that is that I very, very rarely have ever gotten a tablet design. Most designers are just going to create desktop and mobile versions. So sometimes developers have to actually make design decisions and figure out how the content should look on tablet. And of course, if you're at a job, you can always ask your designer if you're not sure about how things should look at a specific viewport. So usually I will have a tablet view be some kind of hybrid between desktop and mobile styles. Now let's dig into this design here, and I'll show you how to find the style rules for the elements and also how to export image files. First off, let's take a look at the left sidebar in the desktop frame. You can tell that it's a frame in Figma because of the hashtag symbol next to it. And if we expand it, then this is going to show you all the different groups of layers that are in this frame. I've tried to keep the layers as organized as possible so that everything is grouped in a way that makes sense. Now, to navigate through the design, with your cursor in the main middle panel, you can use a scroll wheel to go up and down. Also, if you hold down the spacebar, the cursor will turn into a hand, and then you can hold down space and use your mouse to click and drag to move around the design file that way as well. You can also zoom in and out. To zoom in, hold down Control or Command for Max, and then use the scroll wheel to zoom in or out. Now, if we select the desktop frame here, on the right sidebar, we can see information about what we've selected. So for example, in the layout panel here, we can see the size of this layer, which is 1440 pixels wide and 3262 pixels tall. Then if we keep going, we can see other information. For example, we have this fill panel here, and it tells us that the fill color is white, and that is the white background color that we have in the design. Now let's click the color swatch here in the fill panel. This is going to open up a color picker, and this will give us the color information. Right now we have HSL selected, but you can select different color formats like hex. Now going back into the design, one thing to note is that when you're clicking on shapes, like for example the unicorn image here, usually you double click to get through the layers to find the element that you want to select. And if I double click one more time, what is going to happen is it's going to actually select the shape, and then you are going to see all these different circular nodes. And this is a feature that allows you to actually adjust the shape itself if you want to by moving the nodes around. And that's not really what we want to do. So if you get into this mode where you have the circle dots and you want to get out of it, you can press escape or enter, and then you can just click out of it. I just wanted to mention that because it's something that's happened to me a lot of times. Okay, next up, let's take a look at some of the text elements. So I'm actually going to minimize the left sidebar by clicking this close button here. And let's select one of the text elements, maybe the headline here. And you want to basically double click until the headline is selected. And it can be a little bit annoying if you need to click through a whole bunch of layers and you just have to keep double clicking. So an alternative that's faster is if you hold down Control or Command on Macs. I'm holding down Control now. When you hover over different elements, you can just click with Control still pressed, and it'll just click right to the element. So that makes it a little bit faster. So now with the text selected, let's check out the right sidebar. So if we scroll down a little bit, we can see some information in this typography panel here. So this is telling us the font family, Source Sans 3, the font weight, bold, and then the font size, which is 72 pixels. In addition, we have line height, letter spacing, alignment, and so on. Below the typography panel, we have the fill panel, which we were looking at earlier. And this is going to control the text color. So that's the text elements. Let's zoom in a little bit and check out the buttons that we have here. So you might notice that the buttons have rounded corners. So if I select this button, if we go to the right sidebar in the appearance panel, they have a corner radius setting. And this is basically the same thing as CSS border radius. For some reason, they call it corner radius in design tools. And this button is also a good opportunity to show you how to find the distance between two elements in a design, which is a feature that we are going to be using a whole lot. So in the button, if I select the free trial text inside the button and then hold down Alt, it's going to tell me the distance between the text that I've selected and then whatever other element I'm hovering over. So right now I'm kind of hovering over the teal rounded rectangle, and it's telling us that there is 12 pixels of space on top and bottom and 16 pixels of space on left and right. So we can also do something like select the entire button, hold down Alt, and figure out how far it is from the pricing button next to it, which says it's 20 pixels. And we can tell the distance between the text above it and to the button. So this measuring feature is super helpful, and I use it a lot to determine the space between elements. Now, in the same vein of figuring out spacing, Figma lets you use layout grids to make sure that the design aligns with a grid. So if I select the entire desktop frame by clicking on the title here, or clicking on the desktop frame in our left sidebar, then what we can do is, in the right sidebar, if we scroll down, there's a section called Layout Guide. And here I've created a 12-column layout grid, which is currently hidden. You can see that with the closed eye icon. If I click that, it'll unhide, and then we can see our 12-column grid. I also did create a 1-column grid that just is around the content of the website. Now, the last thing that I want to mention is how to export images from the design to image files. So one example is the unicorn image, which we want to export as an SVG because it's an illustration and it has solid colors. SVGs are vector images, which means that we can size them up without losing quality. So if we select the whole unicorn, then in the right sidebar, if we scroll all the way down, there's an export panel. And in the export panel, you can choose the file type that you want to export the image at, as well as the resolution. So for this, we want to make sure SVG is selected, and then we want to click the Export Unicorn button. And now we've downloaded the Unicorn SVG. So most of the images in this design are going to be exported as SVGs because they're really illustrations, and having them exported as SVGs will help save on file size. However, for other images, for example, in the testimonial section, we have this circle author image, which is a photograph. We want to export this one as a JPEG because JPEGs are better for more photographic images that have lots of detail instead of flat shapes like the illustrations. So let's actually export an image that we're going to be using soon, and that's going to be the favicon image. So I'm going to go over to the right where we have the favicon image in its own frame. And what the favicon is it's those little icons for a website that you will see in your browser tab, or if you save a website to your mobile phone, it'll be an icon on your homepage. So in order to get the favicon to load for the website, you need to save the image file in your project root and then add some code in the HTML to link to it. So we'll get to all that in a little bit. First, let's export the actual favicon. So I've made sure that I have the favicon selected, and then we're going to export this, and we're actually going to export this as a PNG at 1x size. All right, so now we have our favicon image. However, using favicons can be kind of tricky because you can't have just one favicon image. There are all different browsers and devices, and they all have different preferred image formats and sizes. And it can be kind of time consuming to try to keep up with all of this yourself. Fortunately, there's a really good solution that will provide you with all of these different images as well as the code that we can put in our index.html file. So I did some research on favicons, and it seemed like a lot of people recommend using a website called realfavicongenerator.net. So I'm going to search for Real Favicon Generator, and here we go, realfavicongenerator.net. So let's go there. Okay, so when we go to this site, it's going to prompt us to upload an image file. And this image needs to be a square image, and it wants to be at least 260 pixels tall. So I'm going in my downloads folder, and here's the favicon that we just exported from Figma. So let's open that. And then once it loads the image, it's basically going to show you what the favicon will look like on different browsers and different devices. So you can leave the image as is, or you can slightly customize how the image looks. So feel free to play around with some of these options. And once you're done with any customizations, you want to scroll down to the bottom and look for the download button. So we'll click next and then click download. All right, so we've clicked to download, and also there is some code that we need to put in the head tag of our HTML. So first let's get the files. And what we got from the Real Favicon Generator site is a zip file. So let's go into the zip file, and we basically want to copy all of these, and then we want to go to our project directory for our website. And I'm just going to put it straight up in the root of the directory. So I've copied and pasted all the files to our project root. Then we want to go back to the Favicon Generator site, and we want to copy the code snippet here. So let's click to copy that. Then we want to go to VS Code. And let's go to our index.html file. And in the head tag, we're going to paste in the code that we just copied. So I'm just going to paste it kind of down here at the bottom. And now when we look at our local website, we should be able to see the favicon loading in our browser tab. All right, so that's a quick overview of the main function that we're going to be using in Figma in this course. And don't worry if you don't remember everything that I just said, because as we build out this website, we're going to be going back and forth in Figma, and I will show you everything step by step so that you can follow along. Now up next, we're going to start writing some more styles. All right, now that we've taken a look at the design, let's start adding our global styles, starting with colors. So I'm going to go through the design and save all the colors as CSS custom properties. So let's start by getting the default background color, which is white. So if I click on the desktop 1440 frame, in the right sidebar, if we scroll down to the fill panel, it tells us that the fill for the entire frame, which is basically the background color, is white, which in hex code is FFF. Now in the right sidebar, Figma is going to display the colors in hex format, but if we click on this color swatch here, it's going to pop up the color picker, and you can change the color format with a dropdown. Now in our code, we are going to be using HSL or hue saturation lightness format For the colors, which you can see if you select HSL in the dropdown, it'll display hue, saturation, and lightness numbers, as well as the opacity, or what's called alpha, as a last number, and that's a percentage. However, since the individual HSL colors are split out, it's kind of hard to copy and paste the whole thing into VS Code. So just for now, what I'm going to do is select hex colors, and then we can more easily copy and paste it. So let's start with this white color. So I'm going to copy the white color, and then let's go into VS Code and start setting up our colors. Now in our style.css file, I said I wanted to store the colors as CSS custom properties, and we want to put them in the root selector so that we can access them from anywhere else in our styles. So I'm going to put the colors before all these other styles that we've written here. And let's create a comment, and I'm going to say colors, just to make it easier for us to find later on. Now we're going to create two sets of color custom properties, one for the actual color, and then one for the colors for where the colors will be used on the website. So let's create our root selector first. And for the white color, the first property we're going to create is double dash, since custom properties always start with a double dash, C for color, and then I'm going to call it white. Then we want to paste in the color from Figma, and we do need to add that hashtag or pound symbol in order for it to be a valid hex code. So now that we've written this, a color swatch has appeared, and we can actually click on it to make a color picker appear in VS Code. And here we can change a color format by clicking on this title bar here. And we want to select HSL. So now we can save, and we have the white color saved as HSL. The next thing we want to do is set this white color as the main background color of our website. So I'm going to create another custom property. I'm going to call this color, and then we're describing what the color is going to be used for. So I'm going to say main-bg. And then I'm going to set the value to var c white. And one cool little VS Code shortcut that we can use is to just start typing the double dash, and it's going to automatically load the custom properties that are available to us. And here we're going to select c white. And then you can see VS Code automatically generated it with the var function, so we don't have to type it ourselves. Okay, now, looking at the colors, having two properties for the same white color might seem kind of weird, but it is going to make more sense when we have multiple properties all loading the same color. And I do like that it makes the colors more descriptive, so you can see, where the colors are all going to be used, all in one place here. Okay, let's go back to the design now, and we want to grab the text colors as well. So if we look at the design, we have a dark gray text color when we have a white background, and then we have white text when it's on a darker background. So we can already reuse the white color since we copied that over already, but let's get that dark gray color. I'm going to zoom in here on the headline on one of the 3 column features, hold down Control and select the title. So now in the right sidebar, here's the fill panel, and here we have the dark gray text color. So I'm going to copy that. Now in VS Code, we're going to first create the color itself. So C, let's say gray dark. Paste in the hex code, add the pound or hashtag, and then convert it to HSL. Now we're going to create the property for where we're using this gray color for our text. So I'm going to say color text dark, and then we'll add in gray dark. So hopefully you can see that for the actual colors, I'm naming them starting all with C, and then where we're using them, we're using the color. And this is just going to help differentiate these two different types of custom properties, and it'll make it easier to scan through all of them once we have a whole bunch here. Okay, so next thing we want to do is create the white text color custom property. So I'm going to say color text light, and we're going to set this to the white color. All right, so let's get some more colors from our design. So the next thing I want to grab is the purple color that we have here for the header and the hero background. Let's go down to fill, and we just want to make sure we double click into the right layer to have that purple color show up. Okay, so got that color, and let's add our custom property for it. We're going to say C purple. And again, we're going to add the hashtag and convert to HSL. Now let's add a custom property for the hero background. And then we're going to set this to the purple color. Okay, let's see. Next, let's also grab the color for the buttons. So in the hero, we have 2 buttons. And when you have 2 buttons, a really common naming pattern is to say the first one's primary and then the second one is secondary. So what I'm going to do is copy the teal color here from that first button. Then in our styles, we'll say C teal, pound or hashtag, and paste it in, and then convert this to HSL. And we also want to get the button text color, but actually before that, let's create the second set of custom properties for the actual button background. So we'll call this color button primary BG, and then set it to teal. Okay, now let's get the button text color. So I'm going to select the free trial text, and it looks like it is the same dark gray color that we used before. So what we can do is just create that second custom property, color button primary text, and set it to the sea gray color. There we go. Okay, so that's the first or primary button. Now let's look at the secondary button for this pricing button. And this one has a transparent background. So I'm still going to set it as a custom property. So I'm going to create a new color property called transparent. And we're going to set it to transparent. And this is a sort of a shorthand keyword that basically maps to black with 0% opacity. And I just like using transparent because it's a little quicker to see and to type. Now let's make a new custom property, and I'm going to say this one is color button secondary BG, and we'll set it to transparent. Now you might notice looking at the design, the secondary button is also different from the first one in that it has a white border instead of a solid color background. And the border and the text are the same color, white. So in VS Code, let's create another custom property. Let me just make VS Code a little wider here. We're going to call this one color button secondary border, and let's set it to white. And then I'm actually just going to duplicate this line and call the second one color button secondary text, and it's also set to white. Okay, let's go back to our design again, and let's see what other colors we need to get. So the next one I think is this full width feature here, which has this magenta background color. So we'll copy that color, and then we want to create a magenta color. C magenta, hashtag, paste it in, click the color swatch and convert it to HSL. And then let's use the magenta color with a new property called color full width BG because it's being used in the full width feature section. And we'll set this to magenta. Okay, so I think that's a good start for all the colors for now. We do have this gradient down here in the CTA call to action section, but we're going to work on those colors when we get to that section. So that's it for the colors, and let's get on to the next section, which is the wrapper styles. Another global style that I like to set up is the wrapper styles. Now by wrapper, what I mean is if we look at the design, all the text and image content on the website is limited to a specific width, and it's not going to go wider than that. So on mobile, if I select some of the content in the website and I hold down Alt, it tells us that there's 24 pixels of space on either side. And if we go to desktop and do the same thing, we have the content limited to 1200 pixels wide, and then any additional space will get added to the left and the right sides equally, keeping the main content in the center. In our styles, I'm going to go down to the bottom of our style.css file, and start creating a new class called wrapper. And let's start with how we want the wrapper to behave on mobile. So on mobile, we want the website content to basically take up 100% of the available width, but to have 24 pixels of space on left and right. So if we add up that space, that's 48 pixels total. And so the actual width of the website content in the wrapper is going to be 100% minus 48 pixels. So I'm going to set the width property, and we can actually do math by using the CSS calc function. So I'm going to write calc, and then in the parentheses, I'm going to write 100% minus 48 pixels. And let's start adding this wrapper class to our website to see how it's going to look. So in the body tag, I'm going to create a new div, giving it a class of wrapper with .wrapper. And then using Emmet, it'll generate the code for us. And then we're going to move the h1 and paragraph tag inside this div. So now on the website, we can see that the width has been limited to 100% minus 48 pixels. However, all of the space is currently on the right side, and we want this to be centered. So one way we can do this is with margin inline and set it to auto. What this does is it's going to make the margins on the left and the right side take up all available space, and they're going to be equal widths, which essentially centers the content. So it's a really handy way to center content for cases like these. In addition, margin inline is only going to set the left and right margins. It's not going to do anything with the top and bottom margins. So this is a little better way of setting margins only on the sides without having to say margin, 0 auto. So the mobile website looks actually pretty good. However, let's see what happens as the viewport width increases and we get to desktop widths. So you can see that the content is basically continuing to get as wide as the viewport width minus that 48 pixels. And this is obviously too wide for desktop. So what we also want to do is we want to set a max width of the wrapper to 1200 pixels. And we could do this with, say, setting max width of 1200 pixels, but I'm actually going to show you a cooler way of doing this, which is still using the width property. So the way that we can do this is with another CSS function, the min function. So what the min function does, and I'm just going to start writing it here, is that it takes two parameters separated by a comma, and then it's going to choose the smallest value between the two. So I'm going to move the calc function into the min function, and this is going to be the first parameter. Then we're going to set the second parameter, and that's going to be the 1200 pixels width that we have from our desktop design. However, we want to use the rem unit for this because it's more accessible. So what I'm going to do is use the calc function again to convert from 1200 pixels divided by 16 because 16 pixels equals 1 rem. And then we do need to add the rem unit by multiplying it by 1 rem. So what's happening here is that in the min function, we have these two values. We have 100% minus 48 pixels, and then the other choice is 1200 pixels. So how does this work out in real life? Well, let's check out our website on mobile view. So in mobile view, we're using the iPhone, which has a viewport width of 375 pixels. So in this case, the first parameter of 100% minus 48 pixels is going to be 375 pixels minus 48 pixels, which is 327 pixels. And then the other choice is 1200 pixels. And so in this case, our two choices are 327 pixels and 1200 pixels. And since 327 pixels is the smaller number, that's the one that's going to get chosen as the value of our width property. We can actually see this if we inspect our website here. So if I select the wrapper div and we go down in our layout tab to the box model, we can see that the width of the content is about 327 pixels, which does match the math that we did earlier. Now let's change to a laptop view at 1440 pixels of viewport width. And I'm just going to zoom out so you can see everything on the screen. And I know this looks very small. So now at 1440 pixels wide, 100% is going to be 1440 minus 48 pixels, which is 1392 pixels. And that's larger than the second parameter of 1200 pixels. So in this case, 1200, the smaller number, is going to be the final width. And again, if we inspect the wrapper, we can see the content is 1200 pixels wide. And then any extra space goes evenly on the left and the right sides, thanks to our margin inline auto style rule. Now, one small side note here, you might notice that I'm using rems for the 1200 pixel width, but in the first parameter, I set the space of 48 pixels using just pixels, not rems. The reason for this is that I like using rems for font size, so they will scale up if the browser-based font size changes. And I also use rems for widths of elements, like the 1200 pixel wrapper. And I also use them for media queries, which we will see later on. But I will use pixels for things that I don't necessarily want to get larger if the font size increases, like margin, padding, and border radius. So let me show you what that looks like. So in the website, I've gone back to the iPhone view on our website, and let's go to our Firefox settings. Now in the settings, I'm going to search for font, and here we can see that the default size is set at 16 pixels. Now I'm going to make it a bigger number. Let's try doubling it to 32 pixels. If we go to the website and reload, you can see that the text size is a lot larger than it was before. So now let's go to our wrapper div. In our styles, I'm going to change the 48 pixels to, instead of 48 pixels, be 3 rems, which is the equivalent when you convert. And watch the space around the text content when I save. So I'm saving now. And now you can see the space got bigger. And it's not a ton of space, and it may not seem like a big deal here, but that is going to compound if the font size setting gets bigger than we set it before. So if we go back to our settings and go from 32 to a bigger number, 48, and then reload the website, you can see that there's just a whole lot of space taking up real estate that we would honestly rather have given to the text, because it's just making the text column pretty narrow. So I think for readability, this is why I like setting our spaces using pixels. So let's go back to 48 pixels. And it is still narrow, but you can see that it is more readable than it was when we were using rems. So that's how the wrapper class works. And this is an example of a helper or utility class where the class name is meant to be reused throughout the website, and it has styles that really just do one thing. In this case, controlling how the content inside the wrapper behaves. And this is a really efficient way of reusing styles because we only need to add this wrapper class to whatever element we want to use it for. All right, so let's go back to 16 pixels in our browser font settings so we can go back to our normal sizes. And next up, we're going to start looking at our typography styles. All right, so let's go back to Figma and check out our text styles. So in the design, I'm going to select the headline up here in the hero, and in the right sidebar, it's telling us that in the typography panel, we're using Source Sans 3 as our font family, and then we have a font weight of bold. Then if we select the paragraph text underneath that, it's still Source Sans 3, except it is now regular font weight. So Source Sans 3 is a Google font, and I'm actually going to show you how to load this font locally instead of using Google Fonts embed code. Let me show you what I mean here. So we are on the Google Fonts website, loading Source Sans 3, and usually if you want to use this, you click the Get Font button, and then you can get the embed code. And what this does is it's going to load the font files from Google, and then also load CSS to load those fonts in your website. And this is not GDPR compliant because this way Google is going to be able to track the IP addresses of all of your website visitors when they load these resources from Google. So what we want to do is to load the font locally with actual font files. And unfortunately, we can't get the font files that we need from the Google Fonts site, but there is a really helpful tool that I like to use. So it's called Google Web Fonts Helper. And if you search for it, it should be this first result here. So to use Google Web Fonts Helper, what you want to do is search the website for the font family you want, Source Sans 3. And then down here, we can select the different font weights that we need. So by default, it's going to check the regular font weight, which is 400, which we do need. And then we also want to get bold, which is font weight 700. So if we keep scrolling down, they also give you the CSS code that you need to put into your website styles. And what it does is in this style, it's going to set a font face using the font family Source Sans 3. And it also is telling the website the path to the actual font file, which we can see here. It's going to default to a fonts subfolder. And for the pathing, they are using a 2-dot thing. And what that does is that will just go one level up from where you currently are. What I like to do with all my paths is I like starting just with a / because the / is going to load you in the project root. And then from there, we'll go to the fonts folder. So I'm going to use this. So let's now copy the CSS styles using the customized folder prefix. So I'm going to copy that and let's go to our VS Code, go to our styles, and I'm going to paste the font styles up the very top before everything else. This way, any style that come after are going to be able to load these fonts. Okay, so now let's go back to Google Web Fonts Helper and we want to download the files. So we scroll down a little more. We can see here, we can download this zip file. So I'm going back to my Windows File Explorer, and in the Downloads folder, we have the zip file for the fonts. So I'm going to double click to open that. And then we have the 2 font files, one for regular font weight and one for bold. I'm going to copy them and then go back to our project folder, which is here. And because of the path, it is looking for that fonts folder. So let's create a new folder in our root called fonts. Then we'll go in there and paste in our font files. So now we have the font files and we have the CSS styles to load the font files. So next, what we want to do is we want to set Source Sans 3 to be our default font. So what I'm going to do is go to the top of our styles, maybe after the wildcard selectors, and I'm going to create a new selector for the body tag. And in the body tag, I want to set the font family to Source Sans 3. And again, if you need to get it, we can just copy it from there and paste it in. And whenever you're loading a custom font, you do want to make sure you have a fallback in case it doesn't load for some reason. So we can do that by adding a comma. And then I'm going to add Arial, and then we'll just use the autocomplete from VS Code to load Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. Okay, so now we have set Source Sans 3 as our font family. If you go back to our website, you might notice that it looks different from the way it did before. So let's just double check and make sure that the font is loading correctly. And in our Firefox DevTools, we can actually go to this Fonts tab here, and it's going to tell us that it's using Source Sans 3. Bold, wait for our H1 tag, and if I select the paragraph tag, it's loading the regular weight. Okay, so that should be all set now with our font family. Next, let's start looking at the different font sizes that we have in our Figma design and start putting those into our style rules. Now, similar to how we did the colors, I'm going to store all the font sizes as CSS custom properties as well. So in our style.css file, after our font face styles, I'm going to add a comment. We'll say fonts, then we'll create another root selector. This is where we're going to load our font sizes. So in Figma, I'm going to go to the mobile design here, and let's just start getting all of the different font sizes, starting from the very top. So up here in the top navigation, I'm going to hold down Control, select the first nav link, and then let's find the font sizes. So they're here in the Typography panel, and it tells us that it has a font size of 14 pixels. So kind of similar to how we did with the colors, we're going to have two different sets of custom properties for our fonts. The first one is just going to be for the font size number to store that. So we'll say double dash FS for font size dash 14. And then we are going to set 14 pixels, but we do want to use rems for our font sizes. So I'm going to use a calc function, and I'll say 14 for 14 pixels, and then convert it to rems by dividing by 16 and multiplying by 1 rem to add the unit. Then below that, we'll start the second set of custom properties for our fonts, and we'll call this one font size top nav. And I'll set the value of this to FS14. Okay, so that was our mobile size. Let's also check and see if this changes when we go to desktop. So if we go to desktop, I'm going to select one of those top nav links there. Let's check our font size, and it does look like it increases to 16 pixels. So let's go back to our styles, and I'm going to duplicate this. You can use a shortcut to duplicate, Alt-Shift down arrow. And then once you duplicate it, we'll just rename the next one 16 and set it to 16. Now, what we need to do is we want to change this font size top nav value to be 16 pixels when we get larger than mobile widths. And we can actually do this by adding a media query with a breakpoint set to, a specific viewport width that we want to change it at. Now, when I'm writing media queries, I'm generally going to start with a mobile breakpoint of around 600 pixels and then a desktop breakpoint at 1000 pixels. And then if I need to, I can add more breakpoints as they're needed. You don't need to create a separate breakpoint for every single, device and phone and tablet. You're really just choosing your breakpoints where you think the design is going to change and you're going to want to have a new set of styles. So try to keep using the same breakpoints across all of your styles as much as you can. This way, everything will change at the same time, and it avoids unexpected behavior that could look kind of weird. So for this breakpoint, it's basically going to be our tablet breakpoint at 600 pixels. So anything larger than that. So we'll start out by writing media at media, and then in parentheses, we'll say width greater than or equal to. And we want to say 600 pixels, but again, we want to use rems because that's more accessible. So 600 divided by 16 times 1 rem. And that's our media query. And then we'll add some curly brackets. So now, in the curly brackets, we're going to set the value of font size top nav to the new font size. So font size top nav. And we're going to change this to FS16. Okay, so now let's go back to Figma, and we just want to keep going through our text sizes here. So let's go to our mobile design, and the next element we want to do is the headline here. Find that elusive unicorn. So on mobile, the font size is 42 pixels, and then let's scoot over to desktop. And it is 72. So it's 42 and 72. All right, so you saw how I did this one before for the top nav text. If you want to try this next part yourself, you can pause the video here and then create the FS custom properties to store those font sizes. Okay, so we need to add 2 more font sizes for the headline text. I'm going to make things a little easier on myself and just duplicate that last FS16 2 times. Then we're going to change the first one to be named 42. Change the font size in the calc function to 42. Then make the second one 72 and 72. Now let's make our more descriptive custom property. So I'm going to call this font size dash H1 because this is our H1 tag and there's only one H1 tag on the page. So the first one, we're going to set it to, by default, 42, which is the mobile font size. And then we want this to change to 72 for desktop. So we can copy this line, and then inside our media query, we're going to change it to 72. Okay, so I think maybe next we'll kind of move on through design and get the other H tags. So the find that elusive unicorn is the H1 tag. If we go down to the next section, we have some other headlines here. And I know that it can be kind of tricky to figure out what H tags to use in your document. Generally, you want to think about your website like a document outline, which can be broken into sections and subsections. So if we look at our design, we really want a title for the entire document, the entire website, which is this, find that elusive unicorn. Then inside your document, you're going to have different sections, and each one of those should have a title. And then each of those sections, if they're broken down into more subsections, each of those might be a title. For example, in here, we have these 3 columns, and those titles would probably be H3 tags. Now, in HTML, the H tags go up all the way to H6, but in reality, you're probably just going to go up to H3, sometimes H4. So let's take a look at the Figma design to see what the outline of our website is and what H tags we want to use for each part. So under this hero section, we have this 3-column white section. Then we have this magenta section. Below that, we have a testimonial. And then we have a call to action section. Now you might notice that some of the sections have a clear title. For example, the call to action has a title, Get Started with Mythos Today. If we go back up to the magenta section, it has a very clear title, Angel Investment Matching in Real Time. However, this 3-column section doesn't have one title for the whole section, and the same actually goes for the testimonial section here. And this can make it harder for visually impaired users who are using screen readers to navigate the website, because the screen reader is going to, read the actual HTML code. So we want to make sure that we're using all the correct semantic HTML tags, and we want each section to have a headline so that they can understand what the section is about. So for example, in the 3-column section here, this contains different features of the product. So if we're thinking about the website as an outline, we would want the section headline of this to be features. Now we can actually do this in our CSS. We can create an H2 tag for this features section, but we can make it visually hidden, but it will still exist in our HTML so that screen readers can actually read it and navigate and understand what the section is about. And I've started doing some of this for you, making some notes here. So next to the desktop design, I have made an outline of the sections as well as the H tags so that you can kind of see how this really does follow an actual outline format. So the purple H tags are the ones that will be visually hidden, so only available to screen readers. And then the visible headlines are the ones in black. And you might notice that I also added some hidden H2 tags for the header as well as the footer. And this is for the same reason as the other hidden H2 tags, so that screen readers can navigate the website better. So like I said earlier, the find that elusive unicorn is what the entire website is about, so it is an H1 tag. Then each section after that starts with an H2 tag. So we have the features with the 3 columns, and then you can see each of the individual features is assigned to an H3 tag, starting with AI-powered matching. Then if we move things down a little bit to follow where we're going, we have the magenta section, which is the full width feature, and that has an H2 tag of Angel Investment Matching in Real Time. Then below that, we have the testimonial, and this is going to have a hidden H2 tag. And then we have the CTA with the visible H2 tag of Get Started with Mythos Today. And then at the bottom with the footer, we have a hidden H2 tag that says footer. So I am going to go over the hidden H2 tags and how to style them in a little bit. But for now, let's get back to getting the font sizes for the visible H tags. So let's get the styles for the H2 tags. Now the first visible H2 is the one in the magenta section. So let's check out the font sizes for that. So on mobile, we have a font size of 36 pixels. Then on desktop, it changes to 48 pixels. Now let's also check out the H2 tag down in the CTA section, because that one is also visible. We just want to see how much are similar and if they're different. So the CTA H2 tag is 36 as well, and on desktop it is also 48. So this means that we can set all the H2 tags to have those 2 sizes. So it was 36 and 48. So back in VS Code, let's create the new custom properties for these two sizes. And we want to add 36, and I am trying to keep these in number order, so I'm going to duplicate the FS16 line and name this 36 and change it to 36. And then the next one is 48, so let's duplicate 42, set it to 48. There we go. Okay, let's move on to getting the H3 tag sizes. And the H3 tags are the ones in the 3-column section. And these look like they're the same font size between mobile and desktop. Let's just double check to make sure. So on mobile, it is 24. And on desktop, it is also 24. So what we want to do is I'm going to duplicate the 16, set this one to 24 and 24. And then we can set we actually forgot to create the H2 font size one. So let's do that first. So I'm going to duplicate the font size H1, set this one to H2, and on mobile it was FS36. And then we wanted to change that for desktop to be 48. Okay, now let's do the same thing for the H3 tag. So I'm going to duplicate this line, font size H2, name the new one font size H3, and then change this to, it was 24 pixels. And this is not going to change for tablet and desktop, so we don't have to do anything else for the H3. Okay, so we have all of our font sizes set for H tags in the custom properties. Now we need to start writing selectors in our global styles for these different H tags. So let's go down to our global styles here, and I'm going to start adding the H tag selectors after the body tag. So the first one is the H1 tag. So H1 tag, I'm going to set the font size to font size H1. And then we're going to do the same thing for the H2 and the H3 tags. So I'm actually going to duplicate the H1 style 2 times. And then let's rename the second one H2. And we want to load the font size H2 property. And then we'll rename the last one H3 and have it load the font size H3 property. Also, while we're here, I like to set the line height, meaning the amount of space each line of text takes up. Now for headers, I generally set it to 1.1, which is 110% of the font size, so just a little bit bigger than the actual font size. So to do this, I'm going to create a compound selector. So before the H1 tag selector, we're going to create a compound selector with H1, comma, H2, comma, H3. And we're going to set this to line height 1.1. And using a relative number for line height, meaning a number that doesn't have a unit, means that it is actually going to change based on the font size. So this is why we can use this compound selector, and the line height will change for each tag depending on what the current font size is. And while we're here setting line height, let's also set a default line height on our body tag. So on body, I usually like to set line height to 1.3 or 130%. And because it's on the body tag contains every other element on the page, so it's going to get inherited to all elements unless we change it on specific elements, for example, these H tags. And the last global text style I also want to set on the body tag is the text color. Now by default, the body is going to have a white background and black text, but we have that gray text dark color. So in the body, let's set color, which is a text color, to color text dark. And this also is going to get inherited to all the children elements, meaning they're going to be dark gray unless we explicitly change them. Okay, so we got all the font sizes for our H tags set. Now, I did want to mention the visually hidden elements. So for these, we won't visually see them, but they still will exist in the HTML, so screen readers can still detect them. However, you do need to hide these in a specific way. If we just use display none or setting width and height to 0, this will actually remove the element from the DOM as well, which means screen readers won't be able to read them, and that's not what we want. So the correct method to visually hide elements I got from a website called the Accessibility Developer Guide. So let's go there. If I search for Accessibility Developer Guide, it should be this website here. Now, I refer to this website a lot when I'm trying to figure out anything related to accessibility, and I do highly recommend using this resource as a reference. So on the website, let's go to the examples here in the left sidebar, and you might notice they have a section here called Hiding Elements. So let's go there. And we're going to use the hiding elements visually by moving them off screen. And the reason I'm showing you this website is because they give us some example CSS that we can use to visually hide elements, but have them still exist in the DOM. So what's happening here is we are going to absolutely position the element, meaning it will not take up space in the website, and then we're going to move it negative 10,000 pixels to the left from its original position, and then sizing it at 1 pixel width and 1 pixel height so that it still exists technically in the website. So I'm going to copy this entire style, and if we go back to our VS Code, we're going to paste it at the very bottom of our styles under the wrapper class. So now, this way we can add this visually hidden helper class to whatever element we want to visually hide. Okay, so I think we are good for our H-tag styles. Next up, I'm going to show you how I'm going to organize our CSS styles. Now, we don't have a ton of styles yet in our style.css file, but as we keep building the website, this file is just going to get longer and longer. So it is important to try to keep your styles as organized as possible so that you don't have any conflicting styles, and also to help make it easier on yourself so you can find the styles that you're looking for in your file. Now, one way we're going to organize our styles is through CSS layers. However, the primary function of CSS layers is actually to give you more control over the cascade aspect of CSS to make sure that the styles you want to take effect will actually take effect. So let me show you a quick demo of how the CSS cascade works, as well as CSS layers. And this is a CodePen that I created, which I'm also linking in the resources section. So let's take a look at the code here. So in the HTML, we have 1, 2, 3 paragraphs, and they each have different CSS classes. So let's take a look at this first paragraph here. And this is going to demonstrate the regular CSS cascade without layers. So this paragraph has 2 CSS classes, text white and text green. And let's go into our CSS file here and scroll down until we find those colors. So again, these styles are not using CSS layers. The text white class sets the color to white, and the text green class sets the color to lime green. Now, according to the regular CSS cascade, because the text green class comes after the text white class, according to the cascade, the green is going to then override the white previous style. And you can see this is indeed what's happening here in our final website. Next, let's compare this with how styles using layers works. So in our styles, if we scroll up to the top again, we have a yellow layer with one style rule setting the color to yellow. And then below that, we have a magenta layer with one style rule setting it to magenta. Then if we go over to our HTML, we have a paragraph with the classes text yellow and text magenta. Now the text magenta class, as you can see, is taking precedence. And the reason for this is because the magenta layer comes after the yellow layer. So any style rule in the magenta layer is going to be able to override styles in the previous layer, even though in the yellow layer, the selector is more specific because it has the paragraph element and it has 2 classes. And the magenta layer only has 1 class, so technically it is less specific than the yellow layer style rule. but because the magenta layer comes after the yellow layer, anything in the magenta layer will override any style rule in the yellow layer. So that kind of illustrates a difference of how the cascade is different when you're using layers. So with this in mind, let's go back to our styles. Now, you don't have to use CSS layers. However, they can help avoid style conflicts, especially if you're loading some third-party styles from a framework, but you want the ability to override those styles without having to wrestle with the specificity of your selectors, or even worse, be forced to use the important rule. So that's why I wanted to include CSS layers in this course. Now, in our styles, I'm going to have two main layers, one for our global styles, which includes everything that we've written so far. Then I'll create another layer for all the components in our website, meaning the different sections of the website. And in doing so, we can allow the component styles to be able to override the more general global styles. So let's start creating our layers. In our style.css file, I'm going to create a new layer at the very top using the @layer rule. And then next we want to give the layer a name. I'm going to call it global. Then we have a set of curly brackets. So now I'm going to move all of the styles that we've created, except for the visually hidden styles, up into our global layer. And when we save, we have prettier. So here we have our global layer. And if I fold this up, you can see that it just folds up everything. So this is the organizational aspect that layers can really help you with. After the global layer, let's create the new layer for the component styles. So layer, and then we'll call it component and create some curly brackets. And for now, we don't have any styles to put in here yet, but we will in a little bit. Now you might be wondering why I have the visually hidden class left outside of this. The reason for that is I'm going to create yet another layer called utility, and I want these utility styles to have the ability to override any other styles if it gets used on an element. So let's create our new layer, @layer, and then we'll call this utility. Utility. And then we'll move the visually hidden style into the utility layer. So the specificity of what layer takes precedence is based on the order of layers. So right now, the utility layer comes last, so it's going to be able to override styles in the component as well as the global layer. And then component styles can override global styles. And this is just based on the order of the layers that we created. However, you can actually indicate a different order from the order that they've been created in. So we could say @layer and then just list the names of the layers in the order that we want them to be in. So I could say global, comma, component, comma, utility. And this is basically going to follow whatever we want. But let's say we want a utility to be able to be overridden by component styles. Then we could do this, and then this would make the component styles have the ability to override utility styles. But we don't want to do that. We want utility styles to be last, so we'll just leave that there. Okay, so that is it for our global styles. Now, since we've finished one big chunk of code, this is probably a good time to create a commit in GitHub to save our code. So I'm going to go up to GitHub Desktop, and then in the Changes tab, we're going to just check over all the different files that we've created since the last time. We have our favicon files, we have our font files, and then we've made changes to our index.html and style.css file. So this all looks pretty good to me. So now let's create our commit message. And I'm going to say add global styles, and then I'll click the commit to main button. Now in this course, I am committing all of my changes on the main branch just because I'm one developer and this is the initial set of commits to build the website from the very beginning. Now in the real world, if I was working on a team, you normally do not want to make your commits directly on main. Instead, you create a separate feature branch and then get them merged back into the main branch. But for this course, we're just keeping things simple and doing everything on main. All right, so next up, we're going to start building the website out, starting with the top navigation. In this section, we're going to start building out the top navigation of the website. So to start off, let's take a look at the design. Now on our desktop design, the navigation has the Mythos logo on the left, and then it has 3 navigation links on the right. And if I think about how I might need to build this, I would probably use Flexbox to lay out these links because I really just want to fit them in one row and I don't need to make them conform to a specific template with sized columns. You could make this work with Grid if you wanted to, but my personal preference for this would be Flexbox. Now let's go to the mobile design, and here the mobile design is pretty much the same as a desktop. The logo image is smaller than what we have on desktop, and then the links are simply closer together. But other than that, the layout is pretty much the same. Now, since a logo is an image, we are going to need to export that from Figma first. So in Figma, I'm going to hold down Control or Command on Max, hover over the logo, and select it. Then in the right sidebar, you can scroll all the way down to the bottom where we have the export panel. And I want to export this as an SVG. We want an SVG for this because this image is made up of shapes with a solid color, meaning that it's really good to export this as a vector image like SVG that can scale up infinitely. So let's click that export button. And now Figma is downloading the file to wherever your downloads get stored. Now we could export this as a PNG with a transparent background, since PNGs can do transparent backgrounds, and they're also good for these flat illustration styles of images. Just keep in mind that PNGs are raster images, meaning they can't be scaled up without becoming pixelated and losing quality. And JPEGs are another type of raster image, but they cannot have transparent backgrounds, so you definitely would not want to use a JPEG for this case. Now, when working with images, one really important thing to think about is file size. And sometimes you might want to see which file type might give you a smaller file size. So just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to export the logo again as a PNG, and we're going to compare the file size between SVG and PNG. So down in the export panel here, I'm going to go to the drop-down and select PNG. Now for raster images, PNGs and JPEGs, you generally want to export them at least 2x the size that it is in the design, because this will create larger images that will not look pixelated on Retina or other high density pixel displays. Now I'm going to get into this concept in more detail later on in the course, but for now, just make sure that you set this to 2x. Now let's click the download button again, and let's go into our File Explorer to compare the image files. So if we look here, it looks like the PNG is actually half the size of the SVG. The PNG is 3 kilobytes, SVG is 5 kilobytes. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that with PNGs and JPEGs, you can actually run them through an image compressor tool. I use tinypng.com as my compressor tool of choice, and it's pretty surprising how much file sizes you can save when you do that. So again, just for the sake of demonstration, let's go to tinypng.com and let's compress the PNG file just to see how small we can really get it. So I'm going to select the PNG, drag it over to the website, and it looks like it saved about half size. So now it is 1 kilobyte. So here we go. We have the PNG. It's really 1.27 kilobytes, but it rounds up to 2. Now the difference between 2 kilobytes and 5 kilobytes is really minor. And in this case, I do want to use the SVG because if we ever need a larger logo somewhere else in the website, we can just use the same file. Now, if the images were a lot larger and more complex, like some other images that we might be working with later on in the future, the difference would be bigger, and we might, in some cases, want to use the PNG. But for our case, for the logo, we're going to use the SVG. So I'm going to copy the SVG from the downloads folder, go to the project root, and in our project, I'm going to create a new folder for image files. And I'm going to call it IMG for image. And let's go into the folder and paste in our logo. Okay, let's go back to Figma and just double check to make sure we don't need any other images for this top navigation, and we don't. So I think we are all set for our images. Now let's start writing the HTML markup for the top navigation. In most websites, you're going to have a header, then the main content, then a footer at the bottom. And this is something that we want to use the correct semantic HTML tags for. So in our index.html file, inside the body tag, I'm going to add a header tag at the top. Then below that, I'm going to add a main tag. And then at the bottom, I'll add a footer tag. And let's move the wrapper div along with the h1 and paragraph tag inside the main tag. Now we are going to put the top navigation content inside the header tag. But before we do that, one thing that's good for accessibility is to add what's called a skip link or a jump link to the top of the page. This will allow screen reader users and users who only use a keyboard to skip over the header and get right to the main content. If there is no skip link, these users will need to manually go through every navigation link in the header before they can even hit the main content of the website. Now, we don't have a lot of links in our navigation here, but for websites that have huge menus with lots of links, having to go through every single one individually would be very annoying to get through. The skip link should be the first content on the website. So right inside the body tag, even before our header tag, I'm going to create a new anchor link, and I'm going to set the href value to #main. This means that clicking on this link will navigate the user to the element that has an ID of main. So let's go to the main tag and add that ID. Now let's go back up to our anchor link and let's add some link text that says skip to main content. This will make clicking on the skip link completely skip the header and the top navigation and go straight to the main tag. Now, if we look at the website, we can see the skip to main content link up at the top. And a couple more things that we have to do is we want to visually hide this link so that screen readers can detect it, but it's not going to visually show up on the web page. Then for keyboard users who might be pressing tab to navigate the website, we also want to make this link visible if it gets highlighted and focused by using the tab key. Now to do all of this, we're going to be using that visually hidden class that we added earlier for the hidden h2 tags. First, let's go up to our anchor link and let's add the class of visually hidden. I'm also going to add a second class called skip. This will enable us to add some more styles specific to this skip link. Now, when we look at the website again, we can see that the link is now hidden. And if we inspect the website, we can see that the anchor tag does indeed have all of the visually hidden styles. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make this link visible when it has focus from the keyboard. And we can actually force this focus state in our developer tools so that we can test our styles out in the browser first. So if we select the link in our source code panel on the top, then in the bottom panel, what we can do is click on this hover symbol and then check the focus link. Then if we click on this plus symbol, it's going to add a selector for the link with the focus state. And here's where we can add our style rules. So let's figure out what style rules that we want to add to this skip focus state to cancel out the visually hidden styles. So I'm going to move the panel up so we can see all of them. So the first thing that I want to do is we want to cancel out that left of negative 10,000% by adding left and set it to 0. Then I also want to cancel out the width and height of 1 pixel, so I'm going to set width to auto and height also to auto. Okay, so that seems to be working. We can see the skip link text on the website, and currently it is overlapping the main header text, so to help with readability, let's add a few more styles. First, let's add a background color of white to the focus state so that you can read it over the header text. There we go. And then let's add maybe some padding around it to add some more space so it's not as cramped. Let's try 10 pixels. Okay, so we're definitely making it more readable. Let's also help to distinguish the skip link from the other content around it. And I'm going to add a border of 1 pixel solid. And by not explicitly setting a border color, it's going to automatically take the border color from the text color, which is currently the blue link text color. So we're just going to leave this for now, and we can always tweak this later on. So this looks pretty good. We can see the skip link pretty visibly. So let's copy these style rules that we added and add them to our styles. So going into our styles, we want to find the visually hidden class that we added, and we want to nest some additional styles in here. So we had added the skip link class to the visually hidden class. So we're going to add ampersand dot skip. And then we also want to add the focus pseudo class. So we can do that with colon focus. Pseudo classes help you select how an element looks when it's interacted with in a certain way or falls under a specific condition called a state. So if we go back to our browser tools, you can actually see some of these different pseudo classes. One of the most common ones is, of course, the hover state, which we worked with before, the focus state, which we're working with now, and other things. So let's paste in those styles that we copied, save, and let's test the website to see if the focus states work. So in the website, I'm going to reload, and then I'm going to hit the tab key. And you can see after I hit the tab key, the link now appears. And if we hit enter, you might not be able to see this here, but in the URL bar, it now says hashtag main, meaning that we've navigated to the main element. Also, navigating to the main tag takes the focus off the skip link, so it has disappeared. And it'll also disappear if we tab off of it to focus on the next element on the page. So it looks like our skip link is working pretty well. Now let's continue writing the markup for the top navigation. In the header tag, the first thing that we want to do is add a visually hidden H2 tag that says header. And if you refer back to the design, in our little outline for the H tags, we have a hidden H2 tag for the header and also for the footer. Now, even though having an H2 tag in the header before the main H1 tag might not technically be good practice, it's not going to break the website, and screen readers will still be able to navigate. And I think that's the most important thing. So in our index.html file, in the header tag, I'm going to create the hidden H2 tag by typing H2 and give it a class of visually hidden. Then press enter, and inside the tag, we'll write the text header. And while we're here, let's copy this header H2 tag and paste another one in the footer, since it also needs a visually hidden H2 tag, and we'll rename the text to footer. So we've saved, and now when we load the website, we can't see the header text. However, if we inspect our code and check out the source code panel, up at the top, we can see in the header, we have this H2 visually hidden tag. And we can see that it is getting the visually hidden classes in the styles. In addition, one thing I wanted to show you is that you can use Firefox's Accessibility Inspector to view the website document, similar to the way that screen readers might view it. So in our DevTools, let's go to the Accessibility tab. And up at the top here in this panel, we can see the document tree. It's called Document. And the name Mythos is actually coming from the title tag in our HTML. Now, if we expand this document node, we can see the other elements in our website so far. You can see the skip link that we created, and the name is coming from the actual text content of the anchor link itself. Then below that, we have this banner node. This is the header tag. And if we click to expand it, we can see the H2 tag loading as a header with a name of header. Then after that, we have the main tag. And if we expand that, we can see the H1 text that we currently have, and then below that we have a paragraph node. And then expanding both of these shows us what's called the text leaf. This is the actual text content in the element. Then below the main tag, we have the content info node. This is the footer tag. And if we expand it, again, we can see our hidden H2 tag that says footer. So I hope this helps demonstrate why semantic HTML tags just make it easier for screen readers to navigate. If everything on our website was, in a div or a span, it would be a lot harder to tell what kind of information everything is. Now let's start adding the other elements for our top navigation. And everything up here is going to be going inside this header tag. Now I'm going to be giving the elements class names according to the BEM or block element modifier approach. This is something that came about from Sass, the CSS preprocessor. But even though we're using pure CSS here, I still like using the BEM style class names just for organizational purposes. So in the BEM approach, you name each separate component of the website with a block name. So in our case, the block is going to be the top navigation. So I want to name our block top nav. Now, since all of the top navigation markup is going to be in the header tag, I'm going to add a class to our header tag, and I'm going to call it the block name of top nav. Then in the header after our H2 tag, I'm going to create a child div with a class of wrapper. All right, let's go to the design now. And I just have the mobile design open for our own reference. So in our top nav, the first thing we want to add is the logo image. So inside the wrapper div, I'm going to add the logo here. And we do want the logo to be a link so that if you click it, it'll load the home page, which is going to be the root domain of our website. So here I'm going to add an anchor link, and I'm going to give it a class of top nav, which is the block name, followed by a double underscore and home link. In the BEM approach, blocks are made up of individual elements. So here, we're starting the class name with the block name, which is top nav, followed by two underscores indicating that the element is coming up next, and then our element name is home link. Now, as an aside, with the BEM block element modifier approach, I generally only use the block and the elements. I don't really use the modifier, which is where you can create alternate styles of elements, but I just wanted to mention to you that it does exist. Okay, so going back to our anchor link, I'm going to set the href attribute to be a /. This will make clicking the link load just the domain, for example, mythos.com as our hypothetical domain name. And the domain is usually what you want to load as the homepage of the website. Now in this logo anchor link, we want to load the logo image that we exported from Figma as an SVG. So inside the anchor link, I'm going to create an image tag by typing in img, and then a dot to give it a class, and then we're going to create the class name, which is going to be topnav, double underscore, logo. So again, we're using the BEM approach for the block name topnav and the element name of logo. Then in our image tag in the source attribute, we need to set the path to our logo image file. Now I'm going to open up the left sidebar to go to our Solution Explorer. And in the left sidebar, you can see the image folder that we created, and inside it is the logo mythos.svg file. And this is the location and file name that we want to set our source path to. So in the source, I'm going to take advantage of the autocomplete in VS Code, and I'll start typing with /, and this is going to load the root directory of the website. You can see all of the files and subfolders are here. Then we want to go to the image folder, and then in the image folder only has one image, logo mythos.svg. So now we've loaded the SVG file. Next up, let's look at the alt attribute. So the alt attribute is where we want to add alt text, which should describe what the image is using text. This is a logo for Mythos, but it's also the link to the homepage, so it would be most helpful to add that information so that screen readers will know right away that this links to the homepage. So I'm going to make our alt text Mythos homepage. Okay, so that should be it for our logo link. After that, we also have the 3 navigation links: features, pricing, and about. So after the logo, we're going to create our nav links, and we're going to use another semantic HTML tag, the nav tag, for this. Inside the nav tag, I'm going to create an unordered list, or UL, tag to store the navigation links, and I'm going to give it a class of topNav _links. Now, the reason that we want to make these links in a list is because they are quite literally a list of links. So again, we're just trying to use semantic HTML tags in the proper place so that they will add more context for what type of content they contain. Now, in our unordered list is going to be the list items using the li tag. So I'm going to create the first one, give it a class with a dot, and say topNav _item. Then inside our list item, I'm going to add an anchor link by typing a dot, and I'm going to give it a class of topNav link. Now, in the real world, each link would go to another page in the website, and that URL would go inside this href attribute. But since we only have the one home page that we're going to be creating, I'm just going to leave this blank for now. Okay, so we have our list item along with the anchor link. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to duplicate it 2 times to get our 3 links. Next, we want to add the link text according to the design. So the first one is features. So inside the anchor link, I'll add the text features. Then we have pricing. And the last one is about. So this is pretty much all of the markup for our top navigation. Now, I know that it can be difficult to know what's considered best practice for things like what HTML tag you want to use. But believe it or not, I don't personally have all the knowledge of everything related to web development just sitting in my head. I always have to do a lot of research when I'm building websites and making tutorials, and most web developers have to do that too. So when I'm building a website and I'm not sure about what best practice is, one thing that can be really helpful is looking at big websites that you're pretty sure follow best practices and to see how they build their websites. So one website that I always like to take a look at is CSS Tricks. So let's take a look at how they build their navigation. So when I inspect their header, it looks like they are indeed using a header tag like we are, and they have a nav tag to contain their links, and they're even using an unordered list with list items for each of their links. So it is a little more complicated than what we have on our website, but it's still a good example to look at. So I hope this helps. I wanted to show you that you don't have to know everything off the top of your head, but you can do research and see what other websites are doing and learn from them. All right, so next up, let's start setting up our styles for the top navigation. Okay, one thing that I'm going to do just for the sake of this video and the course is I'm going to add some space at the bottom of the website so we can see the bottom content up in the middle of the screen instead of being stuck all the way at the bottom. So I think this will just make the watching experience a little bit better for those of you going through this course. And you don't have to add this style, I'm just doing it myself, but I wanted to explain what I'm doing so it's not confusing. So let's go in our global styles to the body tag. And what we're going to do is I'm going to add a style rule of padding block end, and I'm going to set it to 50 VH. So what this is doing is adding a space that's 50% of the viewport height at the bottom of the body tag. And just so I can remember that this is a temporary style, I'm just going to write temporary there so that we'll remember to remove it after we finish building the whole website. Now, you might not be familiar with padding block end. It's actually the same thing as padding bottom. And let me show you what I mean by going to the layout tab. And here's the box model of the body tag that we have selected. And you can see we have padding bottom of 406 pixels because that's half of the height of our viewport height. Now, what this is just, it's basically a new way of naming the directions of padding, margin, and other things. So if your browser is using a left to right and top down direction for the writing direction, which most Western languages are, it's the same thing as padding bottom. So the block keywords is going to be the top and bottom. So padding block end is the same thing as padding bottom. And then the left and right sides are inline. So the left padding would be padding inline start. The right padding would be padding inline end. You can do the same thing with border and margin. So margin inline start, margin inline end, margin block start, margin block end. And one thing that is really great, which we actually used earlier, is margin inline, setting that to auto to center the wrapper. And setting margin inline only sets the left and right margins. And in the same way, you can use blocks. So you can say margin block to set only the top and bottom margins, or padding block to set only the top and bottom paddings. And we will be using these directional properties a lot, so I did want to explain that to you. Now, I know that these terms of the inline and the block and the start and the end, it may seem really weird and overcomplicated as opposed to just, top, bottom, left, and right, but they can be more flexible if you have to, let's say, build a multilingual website which needs to support languages that might go from right to left instead of left to right, like Western languages like English. Because this way, if you need to change a direction, we can use the block and inline and the start and ends to let the browser automatically load the content from, right to left if the writing direction is going from right to left. Now, this is kind of a newer CSS feature, and while modern browsers support them, some older browsers may not. So one website that I often use to check on browser support for newer features is caniuse.com. So if I go to caniuse.com, we can search for the property that we're looking for, and I'll type in logical, because these are the logical properties. So we see here the CSS logical properties. And up at the top, you can tell that globally there is 95% support globally, and that's actually really good. And if you look down, you can see detailed browser information, and the only browser that doesn't support this is basically IE11, as well as Opera Mini, it looks like. But every other major browser is green, meaning that it supports this feature. Now, there are newer features that may not have, the over 95% support. Personally, I like to wait until a feature does get over 90% at least to use it. But you're more than welcome to use features that are less supported, as long as you make sure that there's a good fallback for the older browsers that don't support it yet. Let's start adding our styles for the top navigation. And before we write any styles, I'm going to do a split screen thing in VS Code. So I'm going to right click the index.html file, go to split and move, and then select split down. Then in the bottom one, I'm going to scroll until we get to the top nav header section. This way we can see the elements that we created and their class names to use as reference for when we're adding our styles. All right, so in our style.css file, I'm going to put the top nav styles inside the component layer because it's a component, meaning a standalone section of the website. Now, since I created the top nav class to serve as the BEM block, let's create a top nav class selector. And then I'm going to nest all the top nav styles inside this top nav class. And the reason that I'm doing this is that using unique block names like top nav will help us to avoid any style conflicts from other parts of the site. Now let's start writing the selectors to match all the classes for the top nav elements that we have in our index.html file. So we got our top nav class as our first selector. The next element is the top nav home link. So inside top nav, I'll add another class selector and write top nav __ home link. Then the next one is the image tag top nav logo. So let's add another selector for that. Then after that, we have top nav links, and then top nav item, and then top nav link singular. And that should be it for all the top nav elements. So let's close out of our index.html file and save our changes in our style.css. Okay, now even though we haven't added any styles yet, let's just take a look at our website and see what it looks like to start out. So in our website, we can see that we have our links, and they do have that bullet because we use an unordered list. So by default, they're going to be bulleted list items. Now the logo is here and it is loading the SVG file, but since the logo is white, we can't see it at the moment. So first things first, let's add the purple background color to the header tag, which has a class TopNav. Now let's take a look at the colors that we have in our global styles. And they're here in our root selector. So the purple background color was stored here, and then we are loading it also as color hero background. And this is actually used not only in the hero, but also in the header. So what I think I might do is duplicate the color hero background property, and I'm going to name the first one header. So now we have color header background as well as color hero background. So now we can go back down to our TopNav styles. And in the TopNav class selector, which again is the header tag, I'm going to set background color to _ and we'll type in header, and then it'll autocomplete to color header background. So now when we save, we can see that we have the logo image and then we have the links underneath. Next, we need to style the list items so that they match the design. Lists have a lot of default styles that the browser will automatically add, so we do need to cancel them out in our styles. One of them is the bullet dots, and they're a default style that comes with using an unordered list. And the property that controls these bullets is list style type, and that needs to be set on the TopNav links, which is the UL or unordered list tag, which we can see here. So in TopNav links, let's write list style type, and then we don't want disk, but we want to set it to none. So now when we save, you can see the bullets have disappeared from the lists. Now let's take a look at what other styles we might need to cancel out from these list styles. Now you might notice that when I'm hovering over the UL tag, there's actually, it looks like a purple space here, which I'll force the display of, and that is some padding. However, if we look in the rules tab, we have no padding styles. And this is because the padding is getting added to the default browser styles. And these can be tricky because they're not going to actually show up in the rules tab of our code inspector. But we can see the padding. It's here, 40 pixels of padding left or padding block start in our layout tab. And just as an aside, the UL tag also has some default margins. We just can't see it because we did add this margin 0 rule in our global styles. But if I uncheck that box, you can see that we now have margin on top and bottom. So what we want to do is we want to zero out the left padding for the UL tag. So let's just try writing some styles in our browser styles. So under the TopNav links class selector, I'm going to add padding and I'm going to set it to 0. And now you can see that the padding disappeared and the links are aligned to the logo. If we check out the layout tab, the padding has disappeared. So this looks pretty good so far. We've gotten rid of the bullets and also of the default padding. We will have to keep adding styles to the TopNav items, but for now, let's just start by adding these style rules to our code. So when you're adding styles in the browser, this is just temporary. If we reload the page, these would get reset to whatever is in our saved styles. And one way that you might want to see which styles you did add in the browser is to go to this Changes tab over here. And here we can see that we have changes to TopNav links and we added padding of 0. So you can copy the entire selector and the rule here. You can also just go back to the rules, select the specific style rule that you want to copy and copy that, which is what I am going to do. So let's go back to VS Code, and in TopNav links, we will paste in our padding 0. So now when we save, we can double check and we do not have any more padding. Okay, so we do also need to fix the text styles of the TopNav items. They are using the default purple link color, which we don't want. And, I'm sure there's a lot of other text related styles that we do need to add. So let's go back to the design to see which styles we want to add. So in Figma, I'm going to select one of the top nav items. And if we scroll down, we can look at the typography styles that they have here. And looks like we need to make it bold, and we need to make it 14 pixels on mobile, and there's a letter spacing of 5%. So for letter spacing, usually I use not a percentage unit, but I use the EM unit, because this will make the letter spacing dependent on the font size. So it's a relative unit, kind of like how we used 1.1 line height for our H tags, and that'll change depending on what font size the individual tag is. So letter spacing is actually one case where I do actually like using the EM or the M unit because it is relative. So 5% in EMs would be 0.05 EMs. So we can start adding our styles here. So let's go back to VS Code, and we do need to figure out which selector we want to add those style rules to. So let's go back to our index.html file. The links themselves are in the A tag, and it has the class of topNavLink. And again, I've used the topNavLinks, plural, to refer to the entire group of links in the UL tag, and then link singular is for each individual anchor link. Okay, so let's go to topNavLink in our styles. Now the first thing we want to add is the font weight of bold. So font weight, and you can say bold. I personally like using the numbers, so I'm going to set bold to be 700. And then we also want to add the letter spacing, and 5% is 0.05 EMs. Okay, we've added these styles. Let's just check out our website to see how things look. And I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a little bit better. Okay, so one big thing that we need to do is that in the design, the top nav links are uppercase. So we can do that by adding text transform uppercase. And then we did need to add the font size. So let's go back up to our global styles and check out the fonts that we saved in the root selector here. And we did say font size top nav, which is FS14, and then it increases to 16. So let's go back down to our top nav styles. And in top nav link, I'm going to add font size first before font weight. So font size, and we'll type double dash to go to our CSS custom properties, and I'll type top nav. So font size top nav is what we want. There we go. So it's a little bit smaller now. And we also need to set the color to white. So color and double dash text, and we want text light, which we did set to white. So now when we save, we have our links, and they are pretty close to what we have in the design. And one thing to note is that you do want to make sure you're adding the color on the anchor tag itself, because that's where that default purple color is coming from. So you just want to make sure you're setting the color on here. Otherwise it may not take effect. Okay, so we kind of have the basic styles. We have the logo showing up. We have our links. Next up, we want to write styles to control the layout of the top nav elements, meaning both the logo and the links. Okay, before getting into the layout, I wanted to show you something about which element we want to add the wrapper class to for the top nav. Now, if I inspect the header, we have our header tag, and then we have the wrapper class on a child div inside the header tag. And you might be wondering why we had to create a whole separate child div for the wrapper. So let me show you why. Now, if I manually add the wrapper class into the header tag, just for illustration purposes, you can see now that on the website, we have white space on either side. And this is because we moved up the wrapper class into the header tag, which is now limiting the width of the entire header tag from our styles here using the width property and the min function. So it's limiting the width of the entire header tag, which is where we had our background color set as well. And this is obviously not really something that you want. I wanted to mention it just because it's something that did trip me up when I had to build website sections like this with a full width background color. And we want the background to be full width, and then to limit the width of the content inside the section tag, which has a background color, using a child div so that it doesn't affect the background color, and which is why we had the wrapper in a child div. So hopefully that explanation is helpful to you. Now let's get into our layout styles. So in web design, layout means the visual arrangement of elements on the website, where they're positioned on the page, and how they're aligned in relation to one another. In CSS, we can control the layouts of elements using Flexbox and Grid. And these two features are sometimes compared with one another in a who's better type of competition, but in my experience, they're both great tools with different strengths. Now in our case here, like I mentioned before, I prefer using Flexbox to lay out the logo and the navigation links. And the reason for this is because I just want to fit everything on one row, and I don't care what size the columns are here. I will use Grid when I do want the elements to be in columns of a specific size, whether that's making sure they're equal widths, or if I have a specific width for one or more of the columns. One example of this is going to be the 3-column section that we're going to get to later on in the course, where we have 3 equal sized columns. In these cases, Grid will give you a good level of control over sizing the columns and or the rows by using Grid template columns and Grid template rows. So back up in the top navigation, we're going to be using Flexbox, but we will be using Grid quite a lot later on in the website. Now with Flexbox, you turn on Flexbox by setting the display flex style rule on the parent element, and then adding additional rules to control the alignment of the child elements. In our case, we want to style the logo and the navigation links. So in VS Code, the parent element is going to be the wrapper class div inside our top nav header. And the flex child elements are going to be the direct children, which is the top nav home link, and the nav tag. And for the wrapper div, that wrapper class will be reused in pretty much every section in this website, so we don't want to write any top nav styles on the wrapper class styles themselves. So instead, what we're going to do is we want to add another class to that div called top nav wrapper. So this way, it's going to have the shared styles from the wrapper class, but we can also set styles that we only want to affect the top nav wrapper. So in our top nav styles, we need to add a selector for the wrapper div inside the top nav selector. So in our top nav block, I'm going to add a new selector for the class top nav wrapper. Then in this selector, this is what's going to be the flex parent. So we're going to write display flex. And now if we look on the website, we can see that instead of the links being under the logo, they are now next to the logo. And let's inspect the website to see what's going on here. So now the top nav wrapper div has this flex label. This indicates that it is a flex parent. And if we click this, it's actually going to turn on highlighting on the website itself so you can see each of the flex children. So here the flex parent is a top nav wrapper. The direct children are the top nav home link and the nav tag, as we said earlier. So we can see that just by adding this one rule of display flex on the parent, it's made Flexbox start to visibly work. And by default, it's going to try to fit all of the flex child elements onto the same row. Now Firefox also has a flex inspector. So if we go to the layout tab, and then we scroll up, and we want to expand this flex container panel, we can turn on highlighting and turn it off. We can also choose a different color if we want for the lines. And now we can see that in the wrapper flex parent element, it has 2 flex child items, the top nav home link and the nav. And both of these child items are horizontally aligned to the far left of the container. This is a default way that Flexbox is going to horizontally align items if you don't add any additional rules yourself. However, this isn't what we want from the design, right? We want to have the logo on the far left, like it is, but we want to have the links on the far right. Also, the links themselves are stacked in one column instead of being side by side, which we will get into in a little bit. But for now, let's just focus on the logo and then the links as a group. So with Flexbox, the default direction that the browser will display the flex child items in is horizontal in a row going from left to right. This is because by default, there's actually a property called flex direction set to row, meaning from left to right, since we're displaying content from left to right in our browser. However, if you play around with the flex direction property, it's also possible to change the direction of the flexbox items. So just for demonstration purposes, let me show you what else you can do with this. So I'm going to go into our rules in the browser, and in the top nav wrapper selector, let's add a new style rule with the flex direction property. Now, if we set it to column, keep looking at the website on the right, and now you can see that the items have been placed vertically, one under the other. We can also set it to column reverse, and this is going to order the flex children vertically from bottom to top. Now, if we set flex direction to row, which is the default value, it's going to go back to our default flex direction. Now, when you're working with Flexbox, there are two axes that you are actually working with. There is a main axis along which the flex child items are arranged. If the Flexbox direction is horizontal in a row like we have here, the main axis is the horizontal axis. And there's also a cross axis, which is perpendicular to the main axis. In our case, since our main axis is horizontal, the cross axis is vertical. Now, if the direction is column or column reverse, the main axis is going to be vertical and the cross axis will be horizontal. And it is important to remember what your main axis is when you're trying to align the flex content, either horizontally or vertically, because some flex properties are going to target either the main or the cross axis. To control the alignment along the main axis, we can use the justify content property. By default, it's set to flex start. And this will align the flex child items at the start of the flexbox parent, which in our case is the left side. Now, when I was first working with Flexbox, and even still now, I would always open up a really great resource that CSS Tricks has. So let's go there now. So I'm going to run a search for CSS Tricks Flexbox, and the first result is this guide to Flexbox. And this is super helpful because it has a visual reference for what each Flexbox property does. So let's scroll down and we want to look for justify content. Here it is. And we can see all the different possible values that you can use for the property. Just going to zoom in a little bit. Now in our design, we wanted the logo at the far left and the links at the far right. So if we look at the examples, what we want to use is space between, because it's going to put the flex child items on the edges and put any remaining space in the middle between them. Now, if you're using this guide, just a note, all the properties on the left side of the article are meant to be put on the parent element, and then all the properties on the right side are for the children. Justify content is a parent flex element, so it needs to be added to the top nav wrapper class div, since that's our flex parent. So let's go back into our top nav styles and add that rule. So under the display flex rule, I'm going to add justify content, space between, and save. And now when we look at the website, we can see that the logo is still on the far left, but the links are now all the way on the far right with additional space between them, which is what we want. Next, we want to lay out the navigation links themselves so they're not stacked, but they're all in the same row. And we can use Flexbox for this as well. Now, even though the links are inside the top nav wrapper Flexbox container, it's totally okay to have another Flexbox container in an existing one and having them nest. So like we did before, we need to identify what the flex parent and the flex child items are for the links. Now, if you want, you can pause the video here and look at the HTML markup for the links and identify to yourself which element should be the flex parent and which ones should be the flex children. Okay, if we check out the HTML markup for the links, we want the parent to be the UL tag with the class topNavLinks. And then the flex child items will be the direct child elements of the parent, which in our case here is the li tags with the class topNavItem. So going back into our code, we want to go to the top nav links selector. This is the unordered list. And we want to make this the flex parent. We can do this by adding, again, display flex. And I personally like putting all my flex and grid styles first in the style rules. That's just a personal preference of mine to make it easier to keep all the different styles together. Okay, so now if we look at the website again, we can see that the links are indeed side by side now. However, as you might notice, there are a couple of issues where what we have on the website is not exactly what's in the design. For starters, it looks like all the links are vertically aligned to the top of the navigation bar. But if we look at the design, the logo and the navigation links are all centered vertically. So let's go back to the Flexbox guide to see how to align everything vertically. Now we use the justify content property to align the header items horizontally along our main axis. And if we scroll down, the next property is align items. And it looks like this is what we need in order to align the flex child items vertically on the cross axis. So we probably want to set align items to center everything vertically. Now the question is, which flex parent should we try to vertically align? Because we have two. Going back to our website, since the issue is with the nav links, let's first inspect the UL tag top nav links. Now, if I just hover over the tag in the source code panel, we can see that its height is just the height of the link text, and everything is aligned to the top. So setting align items will align the child items vertically within this parent container. But as you can see, since the top nav link's parent height is less than the height of the entire purple top nav bar, this is not going to do anything. So we don't want to use this rule. Now let's hover over the UL tag's parent. This is the nav tag. And now on this one, we can see that the height of the nav tag is the full height of the top navigation bar. And both the nav tag and the anchor link, top nav home link, are flex children of the top nav wrapper, which is the overall flex parent in the header. Now the reason that this nav tag is the same height as the top nav home link is because in Flexbox, if we go back to the CSS Tricks Flexbox guide, the default value for the align items property is stretch. And this will stretch all of the child items vertically to fill all the available space. This results in all the flex children having the same height, the height of the tallest item. So if we go back to our website, inside the top nav wrapper, the tallest flex child is the logo. And then the nav tag, which based on the text content is shorter than the logo, will simply stretch to fill that space so that they are both the same height. Now this default vertical stretching of flex child items is good to remember. It can often come in handy when you're working with something like cards and you want them all to be the same height. But it can cause unexpected issues, like if one of your flex child items is a JPEG image tag and it gets stretched and skewed. Now, thankfully, setting align items to something other than the default stretch will fix problems like this if you ever encounter them. So in our case, we want to use align item center to center the flex child items vertically inside the top nav wrapper. So let's test this out. In just our browser styles for top nav wrapper, I'm going to add align items center. And now we can see on the website, everything is vertically centered. So let's copy this rule and go back to VS Code. And for top nav wrapper, I'm going to add under justify content, align items center. Okay, so we're definitely getting there. The other issue we need to fix is the links themselves. We need to add space between these flex items because right now they're right next to each other. Now in the past with Flexbox, we had to use either margin or padding to add space between these items. But fortunately nowadays, both Flexbox and Grid can use the gap property to add space between the child items. So let's go back to our CSS Tricks Flexbox guide one more time, and let's look at the gap property. So the gap property is set on the flex parent, and it controls the space between flex items. And it's only going to add space between the flex items. So if an item is first or last, it's not going to add space on the edges, which is really nice. So going back to the design, let's see how much space between the items we need. So if we go into the desktop design, I'm going to select an individual link and hold down Alt, and it tells us that there is 40 pixels of space between the items. Let's also check out mobile. On mobile, we have 20 pixels of space between the items. So going back to VS Code, we want to add space between the items, and these links are the flex children of top nav links. So in the top nav link selector under display flex, I'm going to add gap and set it to 20 pixels. And now we can see that we have 20 pixels of space between the items. And this is for mobile, so we need to add a media query for our desktop styles. And we did use a media query up in our global styles for our fonts. So I'm going to copy this and reuse it. And this breakpoint is at 600 pixels, which is technically our tablet width. So this is going to change it for tablet. Okay, so back in top nav links, we want to add our media query at the bottom. So now at 600 pixels, we're going to change gap from 20 pixels to 40 pixels. There we go. And now on our website, if we make the viewport width larger, you can see when we hit 600, the gap increases. All right, let's take another look at the design for the top navigation. And we basically want to compare what we have in the design with what we have on our website to see what needs to get changed. All right, so when I'm looking at the mobile design here, the first thing that I'm noticing is the logo is a lot bigger on the website than it is in the design. So let's go to Figma and check out the design. So I'm going to hold down Control and click on the Mythos logo image. And in mobile, it's telling us that it's 70 pixels by 20 pixels. Let's also check desktop while we're here. Desktop is 128 pixels wide. So 128 on desktop and then 70 on mobile. And if we inspect our website, we have the image, top nav logo, and in the layout tab, under the box model section, this is telling us it's 115. So that's why it looks kind of cramped. It's a lot bigger than it should be. Okay, so let's look at our index.html and check out what we have so far in the image tag for the logo, which is here. So we're loading the SVG image. We have a class, but we forgot to add the width and height attributes. So let's open the SVG file. I'm going to hold down Control or Command on Max. Click. We've loaded the logo, and I'm going to click up here to reopen as source text so we can see the actual code. And I'm doing this so I can just copy the width and height attributes directly from the original SVG. It's a little bit quicker that way. So let's add this after the class and save. Okay, so it didn't look too much different on the website, but now we want to add styles to actually size the image because you don't want to rely on the attributes to size the image in the HTML. You really want to do it in the CSS. So the image was top nav logo. So we're going to set the width property. And then starting with the mobile styles, we want to set the width, which was 70 pixels. And I'm going to convert from pixels to rems using the calc function. So 70 divided by 16 times 1 rem. We'll convert this to rems. So now when we save, it's a lot smaller on the website. And let's kind of double check this. And now it indeed says that it is 70 pixels. And it's 36 pixels tall. My guess is this is because of the Flexbox, and it's kind of stretching things out. But I think this will be okay for now. I think we could set a height to auto, and maybe that'll help. There we go. So now it's 70 by basically 20, which is what we had in the design. And we also want to add the size for desktop. And on desktop, the width changes to 128. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this media query here. It is changing technically for tablet, but I think that's fine. And we'll change the width to 128. So now in our website, let's see if it changes as the viewport width increases. And it does increase. So let's inspect this. And now it is 128. Now, the height of auto is something that you do want to have on pretty much any image tag because this will help maintain the correct aspect ratio, which is the ratio of the width to the height of the image. And usually that's something that you don't want to change because it can cause skewing if you're loading raster images like JPEGs. So usually actually what I'll do is globally set height of auto to our image tags. So let's go up to our global styles, and here in the image, picture, and SVG tag compound selector, we had max width of 100% and display block. I also want to add the height of auto. So this will just automatically apply to any image on the website. All right, let's look back at our design and see what else we might need to work on. Now, one thing that I'm also noticing is we need to add some space on the top and the bottom of the nav elements, because right now you can see things are really right up onto the edge of the top and bottom sides. So let's go into our design, and I'm going to select the content in the top nav, hold down Alt to see how much space there is. And it's telling us that there is 12 pixels of space on the top and bottom, and then we have the 24 pixels of space on left and right. That's already coming from the wrapper, so we only need to add the 12 pixels of space on the top and the bottom. Now to add space like this, where we're really just adding the space between an element and the edges of its parent, as opposed to space between two elements that are ceilings, I generally like to use padding when we're adding space between the child and then the parent. So what I'm going to do is add some padding to the parent, which is the top nav wrapper. And we want to add padding only to the top and bottom, which we can do with padding block. And I'm going to set this to 20 pixels. And kind of like the gap property for padding, I like using the pixel unit because we don't want the space to get bigger. Okay, so now on the website, we have more breathing room and more space between the nav links and the top and bottom. And we also want to check what this padding is on desktop. So let's go over to the desktop design, and I'm just going to try to select everything in here. Hold down Alt, and on desktop it changes to 20 pixels of padding. So in the same way, we're going to add our media query to the top nav wrapper, and then change padding block. I think I made the mobile one 20 pixels, but it's actually 12 pixels, and then it's 20 on desktop. There we go. So that actually looks closer to the design. There we go. Now, while we're here, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the different types of display values that elements can have. And I'm using this code pen to demonstrate it, which I also have linked below, so you can play around with this on your own later on. So in this code pen, in the HTML, we have an H1 tag, CSS Flow layout demo. We have an image, which is this teal placeholder image. And then we have a paragraph with another image and an anchor link here, and then some more paragraph text. Now let's look at the CSS, and I have almost zero CSS styles. The only thing I've done so far is change the background and the text color, as well as the font family and the font size. Everything else that you see here in the resulting website is from default browser styles. And I'm showing this to you because it's important to know the default styles that come with certain elements so that you don't get surprised by some of this default behavior. And then that way you'll know when to change the default behavior and reset them, kind of like those CSS reset styles that we've added to our website so far. Now, some of these default browser styles are going to determine how elements will be displayed on the page, even if you haven't written any CSS rules to control the layout. Now, as we mentioned earlier, this was because back in the day, before CSS really existed, we only had HTML tags. So browsers back then needed to have a set of rules guiding how HTML elements would get displayed by default. Now on the web, the flow layout, or normal flow as it's sometimes called, is how elements will get displayed on the page by default. And there are two default ways that elements can be displayed: block and inline. So you can think of block elements like paragraphs. They will take up the maximum width that's available from their parent, And if you have multiple block elements, they're going to get displayed one after the other, like paragraphs getting stacked one below the other. Inline elements will by default take up only as much width as their actual content, and they will get displayed next to one another within the normal flow of the page, and they will only wrap to a new line when all the space on the previous line gets filled up. So you can actually think of this like individual words in a paragraph. They get displayed next to each other, and then when you run out of space, they're going to wrap to the next line. So most of the elements that we work with, like divs, H tags, and paragraph tags, are block level elements. But we do have elements that are inline by default. For example, the image tag, also the anchor link, and then some text styling tags like the EM, emphasis, and strong tags to make text bold. There's also a span tag, which I've added in the last paragraph, which you can't see. And this is kind of similar to the div tag in that it's a generic tag. It doesn't really have any visible styling attached to it, but it is an inline element. Now in the CodePen styles, I'm going to write some styles targeting any of the span elements. And in the styles, we're going to make them visible by writing outline 2 pixels solid red. And if we look in the HTML, let's find that span tag. So here it is. And in the website, if we scroll down, this is the span tag in that last paragraph. So you can see that the span tag starts, next to the previous word before it, and then next to it is the word coming after it, and then the words end up wrapping to the next line when they run out of space. Now there's one important quirk to remember about inline elements, and that is that margin and padding don't affect them the way you might think. So in the span, I'm going to add margin 20 pixels, and this is supposed to add 20 pixels of margin on all sides, top, right, bottom, and left. And in the website, you can see that things have changed a little bit, but the margin's only adding space on the left and the right sides. The margin on the left is creating space before the span, and then the margin on the right is creating space after the span. However, if we inspect the span, you can see that the margin on the top and the bottom exist, but they're just overlapping the content above and below it. They're not actually, pushing away the neighboring content. Now, if we change this from margin to padding, you can see that the same thing happens. Nothing actually moved, but the outline did get bigger because padding is added and then outline and border. And if we inspect, you can see that the top and bottom padding are again overlapping with the existing content on the site. Now this is because with inline elements like spans, the display property defaults to display inline. And you can actually see this default style. I have the span selected here, and if I go to the Computed tab and check the browser styles checkbox, this will display all the default browser styles as well. And we can filter for display. And here we can see it's set to display inline. Now, by contrast, if I click on the paragraph tag, it tells us that the default display is block. So let's go back to our span tag. With inline elements, the browser is keeping the element in the normal flow vertically, meaning that it's not going to be on its own line, but it is going to be next to other elements. And this is why the vertical margin or padding doesn't have any effect, only the horizontal margin and padding. So going back to our CodePen styles, if I add a display block, it's going to make the span a block element. And you can see that things have changed actually a lot, because it's now in its own block, meaning it will take up 100% of the available horizontal space and make it on its own line. And you can see that the top and bottom margins or padding actually do take effect, and they push away the elements on all sides. There's also a hybrid of inline and block called inline block. So if I change the display value of the span to inline-block, you can see that if there is enough space, it's going to be displayed next to the words before and after it, but the top and bottom margins do still take effect, unlike the display inline elements. So let's go to inline now, and now you can see the top and bottom padding is not taking any effect. So hopefully this helps explain the different display values that elements can be on the page. Now let's take a look at how images behave with their default inline display. Now if I highlight the paragraph that's under this image, you can see that there's actually a tiny little space under the image before the paragraph's top margin begins. This little space is because images are by default inline. Now usually inline elements are text, like words in a paragraph, and with text, most of the letters are going to be aligned to the bottom of what's called the baseline. However, some letters have descenders, which will extend below the baseline. This would be like the lowercase letters p, q, y, and others. So to account for this, browsers are automatically going to include a small space below that baseline to have room for descenders so that the lines of text don't overlap. We can see this too when we highlight the H1 tag. The bottom part of the lowercase y kind of extends below that baseline. So, browsers will automatically leave some space at the bottom of all inline elements to leave room for letters with descenders. Now, since images are by default inline elements, the browsers will also make the image itself sit on the baseline. But then they also will leave some invisible space for descenders. So a lot of times you don't actually want that little space under an image because it doesn't have any descenders. So what I usually do to get rid of that space is I'm going to set the image tag to be display block. This way the browser is not going to use the baseline to align the image. And as a side note, if I ever have a situation where margin or padding don't seem to be working, I'll often try adding display block to see if it fixes things, which oftentimes it will. So let's go back to that paragraph under the image. I'm going to force highlighting of it so we can see, and you can see that since we added display block to the image, that little space is no longer there. So hopefully this little demo helps to explain the different display property values that you can have. Let's now go back to our website. One other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit more is why we have to include the width and height attributes in our image tag in the HTML. This is so the browser knows how big the image is going to be even before it finishes downloading and loading the image. Image tags are what's known as a replaced element, where the actual content of that element is determined not by the HTML code, but by an external object. And by this we mean something like the external image file that we're loading for our logo image. Now, since it usually takes a little bit of time for the browser to download the image file, initially when you load the website, the image is actually going to have 0 width and 0 height. And you can see this if we go and emulate a very slow connection on our website. So first I'm going to remove the width and height attributes that we added to the index.html. I'm also going to go into our styles and I'm going to comment out all of our logo styles. So now we're going to reload the website, seeing the logo image as it is by default. Now on our website, I have responsive design mode turned on and I can control the connection up here. And I'm going to select a really slow 50 kilobyte connection. So now I'm going to reload the website, and while it's loading, keep an eye on the top navigation bar, specifically the logo image. So you can see that it took extra time for the logo image to load, and in the process the navigation bar jumps in height, which causes all of the website content to slightly move down. This is called a layout shift, and it's not a great user experience because if the shift happens while you're reading content on the website, it can be jarring or confusing. Now obviously on a faster or higher connection, this logo wouldn't really cause layout shift since it's such a small file. But a lot of times websites have really large JPEGs or other images, so even on average connections, layout shift could happen. Fortunately, we can fix this problem. So in order to avoid the movement, I'm going to put the width and height attributes back in. I'm also going to uncomment our styles. And now when we reload our website, you can see that there's no more layout shift. The image loads automatically at the size that we wanted it to. Okay, so that's the last bit of CSS Flow layout. Next up, we're going to talk about hover states. When you're working with links and elements that are clickable, it's generally considered a good user experience to change their styles when you hover over them in order to signify that they are links. We can do this by adding a hover pseudo class to our selectors for the top nav links. Let's start with the logo. And we usually want to add the hover pseudo class on the anchor tag itself because links are what you're going to be hovering. So for our logo, this is going to be the top nav home link. So in our styles, I'm going to go to the top nav home link selector, and I'm going to add the hover pseudo class by writing an ampersand and then :hover. We need this ampersand to indicate that we want to target the hover state on the top nav home link element itself. If we didn't have the ampersand, this would be targeting a child of the top nav home link element. Pseudo classes are selectors that indicate some kind of changed state, and they're always written with a single colon and then the name of the pseudo class, in our case, hover. Hover is one of the most commonly used ones, but there are many others. Now in the curly brackets, we want to write our change styles when you hover over that logo home link. One really common hover state style is to reduce the opacity a little bit on hover to make it look kind of semi-transparent. And we can do this by adding the opacity property and setting it to a number less than 1, which is the default. The opacity of 1 would be 100% opaque, meaning it's totally solid and not transparent at all. If we wanted 50% transparency, we would set it to 0.5. That might be a little bit too transparent, which would make the logo not as readable, so I'm going to increase this instead to 0.8 to be 80% opaque or solid. Now let's save, and on our website, I do have the mobile version showing here, so if we want to look at the actual hover state, we just need to uncheck this touch control here, and now we can hover over the links. So let's zoom in a little bit. So you can see when I hover over the logo, it does get a little bit transparent, which makes it less bright. And to me, this might be a little too much, so let's debug this hover state style in the browser to figure out what we actually want the hovered opacity to be. One really helpful feature when you're working on hover states is that you can force the browser to display different pseudo classes like hover. So I'm going to right click and inspect the logo, and I'm going to make sure that we have the anchor tag for the top nav home link selected. Then in the Rules tab, if you go to the top right of the filter styles, there's a little icon that says :HOV. And if we click that, the browser is going to display checkboxes for the different states that you can force. We're working with the hover state, so I'm going to check the hover box. And now you can see that the hover state has been activated. If we look on the website, you can see that it does make the logo a little bit semi-transparent, and now the hover state style is visible. So I'm going to increase the hover state opacity a little bit more to 0.9 instead of 0.8. So now when we hover, it's going to be 90% opaque. And let's toggle this checkbox just to see the different states and how they look. So I think 0.9 looks pretty good. So let's go back into our code, and we're going to change the opacity on the hover to 0.9 and save. Okay, so we're also going to work on the hover state for the text links. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is figure out what selector we want to use to target the text links. Now, if you want to try this yourself, pause the video here and figure out what class we're going to target in our styles, and also add the hover state pseudo class to that correct selector in our top nav styles. Okay, so let's check out our HTML. And the text links are in the top nav links unordered list. And we can see that the actual anchor tag has a class of top nav link. So top nav link is the class that we want to target for the hover styles. So let's go into our styles and find the top nav link singular class selector. And let's add our hover state pseudo class. So kind of like what we did earlier for the logo, we're going to add an ampersand to make sure we're targeting the actual top nav link element itself. Add a colon, and add hover. So what I think I'm going to do is add a line at the bottom of a link when we hover over them. So I'm going to add text decoration, underline. So I'm going to save. And now on the website, when we hover over a text link, you can see a white underline appears. And it is white even though we didn't specify a color, because by default, the underline is going to be the same color as the text color, which is set to white. So let's inspect this and let's force the hover state. So making sure that the HOV icon is selected, we're going to check that hover box, and now you can see the underline is always displayed under the text link. Now by default, the text decoration underline is going to be 1 pixel of thickness, and we can actually customize the look of the underline a little bit with some additional properties. For example, if I want to make the underline thicker, I can add text decoration thickness, and let's set it to 2 pixels. So now when we hover, you can see the underline is a lot thicker. I'd also like to move the underline down a little bit below the text. We can do this with text underline offset. And let's try 4 pixels for this. So now you can see the underline has moved down from below the text. So I'm going to inspect this one more time, click on that hover state, and you can see all of the styles that we've added. And text decoration is actually a shorthand property. If we expand it, you can see that we can set text decoration thickness inside the text decoration property as well. So let's go back to our styles and move that up. So I'm going to take the 2 pixels, add it after the underline, save, and now on our website, we have our underline going, and we only had to write the 2 lines of code here. All right, so I think we might be all set with our top navigation styles. Let's go back one more time and compare the design with what we have on the website, starting with the mobile website. So if I eyeball the design and the website, things actually look pretty good. We have the spacing seeming right between the links, and the logo seems to be sized correctly, and the text links seem to be sized correctly as well. Let's check out the desktop design. And I know it's a little bit hard to see because we're zoomed out so much, but on desktop things look pretty good as well. We are at a 1200 pixel wide desktop view, and that seems pretty good. If we go wider, you can see that it does seem very close to what we have on our desktop design. All right, so I think we're pretty good with the top navigation section. So since we finished this section, we should commit our changes in GitHub. So in the GitHub desktop app, let's look at the Changes tab. And again, we want to just eyeball the changes that we've made and make sure everything looks okay. So everything looks good to me. So let's write our commit message. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm going to write top navigation. And then I'm going to click the commit to main button. And it's probably a good idea to push up all of our changes to GitHub as well. So I'm going to click the push origin button to do that. All right, and that's a top navigation. So I hope you enjoyed this course preview and found it helpful. Again, this is only the first 3 hours of the course. The full course is 15 hours total, and it's broken up into 2 courses, the basic and the ultimate. Now, if you want to check out the full course, I do have everything linked down below, and I do use PPP pricing if that's something that would be helpful for you. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.